Okay, so we'll move through the agenda then. So there are no apologies yet. Sinead, I think Economy Committee is still ongoing, or just finished, but she'll obviously need a break at some session. We have 3 people online today. We've got Stuart Dixon, Deputy Chair, Carol Killen and Claire Sugden. So are there any declarations of interest to declare? No? Okay, so just under Chair's business, there's just one issue I want to raise, and sort of off the back of the stakeholders session this morning, although I will get to that in more substance later, but it just reminded me that we wrote to the Secretary of State through the Northern Ireland office back in May asking for an update on the Bill of Rights, and we didn't receive a response. So I'm just seeking your agreement that we write back to the Secretary of State to ask where that response is. Okay, see people online nodding. Okay, so members' draft minutes are in your pack, pages 7 to 13. Are people content with these as a true reflection of the meeting? Okay, so no matters arising. So we're going to go into our first session, and I'm going to invite our first panel forward, please. So I have Ian Crozier, who's the Chief Executive of the Ulster-Scots Agency, and David Gilliland, Head of Development at the Ulster-Scots Agency. So thank you very much, gentlemen, for appearing today, and sincere apologies. You were geared up to come about 4 or 5 weeks ago, and we had to cancel at very short notice, so apologies for any inconvenience that caused. Thank you for your paper. It was very direct and to the point, and that always makes our lives a lot easier. But would you like to go ahead and make some opening remarks?
Thanks very much indeed, Chair. So we obviously welcome the opportunity to come along and speak to the committee today. We've set out a number of points in the paper and made some recommendations, and I suppose really it's in an effort to enlist the support of the committee in trying to kind of roll the pitch, as it were, ahead of recruitment of commissioners and so on, in an effort to try and maybe avoid some potential pitfalls that we see coming down the road. The agency was involved in lobbying the government at the point whenever the legislation was going through Parliament. Unfortunately, we didn't get as many changes made as we would have liked. So not all of the concerns that we have were addressed at that point. So obviously what we're trying to do now is see where the opportunities are for some of those things to be dealt with, perhaps in an administrative way, so that some of the shortcomings, some of the gaps can be filled. And really it's around those kind of 4 areas that we've identified in terms of that kind of definitional piece, in relation to the fact that the Commissioner is the Commissioner for the Ulster-Scots and the Ulster-British tradition. So that in itself is a bit of a mouthful for people, but also belies a complexity, because the Ulster-Scots, people are kind of already, and we see this when we're talking to officials, are treating this almost as a kind of just single lump and mass. It's the Ulster-Scots, Ulster-British Commissioner, it's the Ulster-Scots Commissioner, it's the Ulster-British Commissioner, when actually the terminology that's used signals differences. So when they say the Commissioner for the Ulster-Scots, it's the Ulster-Scots community, which reflects the recognition under the Framework Convention for national minorities, and the Ulster-British tradition. So one of them, you're talking about a community of people and the cultural things that flow from that, and the other one then obviously you're talking about a set of traditions. So obviously our concern as the Ulster-Scots Agency is not to diminish the importance of Ulster-British and that side of things, but just to make sure that whenever things begin to be rolled out, that actually the water is not muddied, as it were, in relation to Ulster-Scots. So a lot of the human rights protections and things apply specifically to Ulster-Scots, and to the extent to which some of certainly the linguistic ones will not apply to Ulster-British. So the extent to which some of those apply, will need to be explored, I guess, in due course. But what we're obviously keen to make sure is that the focus on Ulster-Scots is not lost. And we've already seen some examples within the public sector, unfortunately, of people taking action, not quite sure on the definitional side of things, and then you end up just with suboptimal outcomes coming out. So that's a thing that we want to try and avoid. Obviously then there's a piece in relation to the functions of the Commissioner. So the Commissioner's role relates specifically to language, arts and literature for Ulster-Scots, whereas obviously the established policy and practice in the last 20 years has been working on language, heritage and culture. All of the human rights mechanisms there are broader than language, arts and literature, so we think obviously there's an issue. So for example, there's a strategy that's working its way through the system at the moment in relation to Ulster-Scots. The basis of that strategy is language, heritage and culture, and reflecting the breadth of the human rights stuff. So you now end up potentially in a position where you have a Commissioner. The Commissioner's meant to support the implementation of the human rights stuff, but actually has had its remit curtailed in a way that all the stuff that's covered by the strategy won't be covered by the Commissioner. So that's potentially a pitfall as we see it. You've also the issue then about the redress mechanism. So actually the Commissioner will be able to issue guidance in relation to the human rights treaties that are covered within its remit, but you won't be able to make a complaint to the Commissioner if somebody hasn't followed that. The other aspect of it is that whereas with the Irish Language Commissioner there's a duty to have regard to the guidance that's issued, there is no duty to have regard to any guidance issued by the Commissioner for the Ulster-Scots and the Ulster-British tradition. So, in our experience already, working with local councils and so on, whenever people, this has been litigated in Belfast, whenever people have gone to the local council and said, you have a duty to do X, Y or Z under, in that particular case it was the Framework Convention for National, the European Charter for Regional Minority Languages. The first thing that the council does is defend the position and say, no, we don't have an obligation to do what you're saying. So obviously our fear is, as soon as somebody approaches a council and says, you're under an obligation to have regard to this, somebody's going to go, oh, let's consult the lawyers about that. And the lawyers then go back to the legislation and go, we find no obligation to have regard. There's an obligation to have regard written in respect to the Irish Language Commissioner. There's no such obligation written in for the Ulster Commissioner for the Ulster. I'm even choking on the Commissioner for the Ulster-Scots and the Ulster-British tradition. So there is no obligation on the face of the Act. In fact, whenever amendments were brought to create such an obligation, the government refused to accept them. So actually, when a court now goes to look at that, we fear that they will say, well, there's nothing on the face of the Act there that says you must have regard, and the government refused to create any positive obligation in that. So we have a fear that people think that we have additional rights, we have additional protection, but actually the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. So one of the things that we're recommending is that needs to be monitored very closely to establish whether in fact you've got a functional human rights protection or whether you've actually got something that is there only on paper. And the final point, Chair, just the NDNA agreement talked in respect of both the two agencies of the language body, that the commissioners, there should be close cooperation between the commissioners and the agencies of the language body. So we've put a number of suggestions in there in terms of things that we think might be worth considering, in terms of could we, for example, get a memorandum of understanding up and running between, and these arguments equally apply to Foras as well. Is there the opportunity, for example, because the Ulster-Scots agency is not one of the agencies that's covered by the remit of the Commissioner, there's an opportunity potentially for the agency to provide back office service perhaps to the Commissioner's office. So, on finance and administrative things, does the Commissioner's office need to employ additional staff to do that? If the Ulster-Scots agency could do it for them, and in fact what you might be able to do is then concentrate resources on the business end of things in terms of providing the supports and the protections that are meant to be there. The other thing is hobby horse of ours, and Ms Nichillen will be well aware of it because she launched it for us whenever she was our minister. We've been working on developing an Ulster-Scots hub in Belfast, which is a kind of longer term project, but there's clearly an opportunity for co-location for the Commissioner's office to be part of a larger sectoral hub, and obviously that maximises the opportunity for it to reach out into the community that it's meant to be working with. So there's a series of thoughts there, Chair, in terms of how some of these kind of pitfalls might be avoided, just to maximise it for the benefit of everybody.
Absolutely, thank you. Do you want to make any comments at this stage, Stuart?
No, I'm fine, thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I have a number of questions on some of the issues that you raised there. I was ready to pit against the Executive Office officials, so I'll maybe touch upon those as well. But I suppose I want a little bit of an understanding as to why the government at the time refused the amendments to introduce that duty to have due regard to. I mean, it nearly blew my mind when I read it on the paper today.
Well, Chair, I mean, to be honest, the government didn't really explain to us. I mean, we corresponded with ministers at the time, what the issues were. It was clear that what was happening was that there was a comparison being done. So, for example, in relation to the complaint side of things, the view appeared to be, well, the Commissioner for the Ulster-Scots and the Ulster-British tradition has a wider remit than the Irish Language Commissioner, in the sense that it also covers the human rights treaties. The Irish Language Commissioner doesn't have that aspect. And the government wanted to support the language aspects of the two roles with the complaints mechanism. Now, the argument that was made at the time was, okay, but what you've got is an Irish Language Commissioner, and basically the language aspect of the role is the whole deal, which means that the entire critical mass of that office is underpinned, its work is underpinned by the complaints and redress mechanism. The language aspect will in truth be a relatively small aspect of the other Commissioner's role, which means that in terms of the actual teeth of the thing, that the two of them are quite different.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, because I was on the talks in 2017 whenever we were looking at the sort of tripartite approach to the languages, and the Ulster-British really wasn't a big feature at that time, and we did recognise, and as you know, my husband is a linguist and Ulster-Scots one of his languages, so we were very cognizant of the fact that it's not just the language, it's the culture, it's the traditions, it's the whole sense of community, and we were not trying to say that there would be an equivalence, but certainly that they were both equally important. Has a discussion ever taken place around what the role of the Office of Identity and Cultural Expression will do? Because it would seem that the Ulster-British part would actually sit better in there in terms of protecting the cultural traditions of all sections of society.
We haven't had that discussion, because obviously our principal interest is in relation to the Ulster-Scots side of things. Okay. Certainly when we've been, in relation to the OIS aspect, whenever we were talking at that stage to the Northern Ireland office, we were also raising issues around the broader resourcing picture. Yeah. Because one of the things that we highlighted to them was that at the point where one of the things that flowed from NDNA, not directly in relation to the legislation, but one of the things that flowed from NDNA was that the government ratified the Framework Convention for National Minorities for Ulster-Scots. one of the provisions of the Framework Convention is that the community that's recognised shouldn't be subjected to discrimination in relation to its culture. And on the day that the Minister made the announcement that he was doing that, he also announced a £4 million capital injection in the Irish language sector, for which there was no equivalent. Now, obviously, we raised that with the government at that time, and they said to us, but OIS will have funding. OIS will be able to put money into projects in the Ulster-Scots sector. I'm not sure that that's the case. Yeah. So, because it seemed to me that the power of OIS is quite closely tied to the principles. And the principles seem to be very much in the direction of, and of course there's nothing wrong with this, it's not a criticism at all, but that's very much in the direction of intercultural work and kind of shared future and that kind of thing, yeah. which is fine, that's great. But question then potentially the extent to which pure Ulster-Scots projects might then flow from that. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean that certainly was a thing that we raised with them. That's about the extent of discussion we've had with government in relation to us at this stage.
Just final one for me before I bring in the deputy chair was online there. The final one for me. So, what engagement are you having currently with the Executive Office? They've got these two branches. One's called the Identity and Cultural Expression branch, and then they've got the Language Commissioners branch. How closely are you as an agency working with them in terms of the documents that they have told us that they're preparing in anticipation of these commissioners?
We were approached by the branch that's looking after the commissioners' recruitment. And asked to nominate somebody to sit on the panel, okay, which we've done, but that's the extent of it. Okay. And in terms of the other side, no. In terms of the other branch.
Okay, no, I appreciate that. I might come back in once we get through. The Deputy Chair's dropped offline there, so I'll go to Timothy, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thanks very much for coming along to committee and for providing your submission. It's been very helpful. There's some of the things that I intend to ask. You've touched upon them in your opening gambit and potentially in some of the questions. So, starting off, functions of the Commissioner, bullet point 6. The functions of the Commissioner as they relate to Ulster-Scots are restricted in their scope to include only language, arts and literature. Could you spell out clearly what you believe the functions should be expanded to include?
Well, if you were to take it, Chair, in terms of the existing policy, in the existing policy framework that we've been operating within, not set by us, but set by our, Department for Communities, DCAL, and so on, has consistently been wider than that. For example, back to St Andrews, it was language, heritage and culture. The strategy which Minister McKillen launched in 2015 was language, heritage and culture. And that's been consistent all the way through. So that means then that things like cultural heritage, museums, so all the stuff that's done by national museums, for example, is in the heritage space. It wouldn't be caught by language, arts and literature. The work that we do with, for example, Union Theological College, so we support work. Now, question is, does literature within the meaning of language, arts and literature mean all books ever written about, by, pertaining to Ulster-Scots, or does it mean literature written in Ulster-Scots, in the way that English literature means literature, or does it mean all books ever written about or relevant to? So there's a question there as to how that will be understood. But for example, our work with Union Theological College has moved in, has included, for example, work to support refurbishment at their building. That's clearly not language, arts and literature. So where you're in the space of how are physical heritage and cultural assets to be protected, the Commissioner won't have a remit in relation to that. So all of the heritage assets that are out there, whether they are tangible heritage in terms of artefacts or buildings or whatever, there's going to be a space, there's going to be a gap in there. We're moving into a space now with with Union College, where we're looking to launch an essay competition for young people. So, for example, religious studies is the most popular A-level subject in Northern Ireland. So, does running things like that, getting into the study of religious studies, which under the human rights provisions is recognised as being intrinsic to Ulster-Scots. So if we're saying to young people who are doing RS as it is now, or who are going on to study theology, we'll talk about the extent to which Presbyterianism is intrinsic to Ulster-Scots cultural identity, talk about the impact that has had. Well, are we now saying, well, the remit of the Commissioner doesn't cover that aspect of the cultural identity, which is covered in the international law, which would be covered in the language, heritage and culture within the policy framework, but is potentially not now covered. So, what the Ulster-Scots Agency considers to be a large part of the audience, and now you've got a question mark over, well, are they included within the remit of the Commissioner? So that's the kind of space that there are big chunks that are left out, and potentially big chunks of the public sector, because look at National Museum's a big thing. The Ulster-Magan Folk Park, huge part of telling the story of Ulster-Scots and the Ulster-Scots diaspora going to America. Is it outside the remit of the Commissioner? Certainly not outside the remit of the Ulster-Scots strategy, not outside the remit of the Ulster-Scots Agency, but potentially is outside the remit of the Commissioner.
Thanks very much for that, Ian. Moving on to the extent and effectiveness of redress mechanism 13. In your submission you pose a question. The first area of concern that we have here is the fact that the Act does not create a duty to have due regard and respect of our Commissioner. If there is in fact no duty to have due regard, how can a public authority breach the duty? Very, very, very good question. I don't mean this to be taken the wrong way. So the Commissioner as it stands today in law, is it just there for the optics? Is that what's coming across? Is it a case of the Irish language groups were pushing for more status, official recognition, and it was almost seen as, oh, hold on a minute, we have to do something here for the Ulster-Scots side, so that they have, that side of the community has been seen to get something from the process. Is that how it's come across to yourselves?
Chair, I can't really speak to the motivation, but we have a concern. Look, you said the submission was straight to the point. Ulster-Scots generally tend to try and be straight to the point. Paper doesn't refuse ink. You can write anything you want down in a political agreement. You can write anything you want down on the face of a bill in Parliament. There's every possibility it'll turn out to be a pig in a poke, as we would say. So we've had a human rights protection under the European Charter for Regional and Minority Languages for 25 years. Has it made a demonstrable difference to Ulster-Scots and the lives of Ulster-Scots people? No. Is there a long pile of deliverables that have appeared because we have it? No. So the fear in this, and I suppose really as opposed to talking about the headspace of the people who did it, thinking about the headspace of the people who are the receivers of it. I think there are a lot of people out in the community who are waiting to be convinced about the benefit that will come from this. everybody lives in hope that these things will deliver tangible improvements, and on the face of it, they do. On the face of it, the potential is there. But as with everything else, it's tempered by people's understanding of the things. Does everybody agree that it says what we think it says? Yeah. Are the resources there to make it happen? Many a twig, many a slip, twixt cup and lip. Unfortunately, we have a bit of a track record of the cup keeps slipping.
It seems to be, when it comes to this commissioner, that certainly there hasn't been much thought. Would you say that you feel shortchanged when you see what the Irish language has?
Well, I don't want to take anything away from what the Irish language folks have achieved. People lobby, people make the case, people achieve things. We're not looking to take away from that. I think I do personally have a fear that if what people see is lots of deliverables, lots of progress for the Irish language community, and then end up looking at a position where the deliverables for the Ulster-Scots community look a bit threadbare, then that's just not going to help the optics overall. I think what we really want to be looking for is balanced delivery across the cultural communities in Northern Ireland. I think that's what everybody would be hoping for. I'm sure that's what the Irish language community is hoping for too.
I'm going to move on. I'll bring you in if we've got time at the end. Carol, go ahead, please.
So for Faye, welcome to the committee. Ian, I'm not expecting you to respond to this, but here's another example where the British government didn't particularly listen to anybody, and the bulk of work that was done, particularly on the strategy from 2015, somebody who was very committed and still very committed to that, and I'm just disappointed, to put it mildly. But reading some of the comments from, say, Foras and Gaeilge and some of the other groups within the Irish language sector, they've also got concerns regarding, the duties and what the commissioner will do. So the question I would have is it better getting a commissioner there to ensure that all the stuff that you've outlined is achieved? Because it's up, from my point of view, I think it's up to each of these individual commissioners to work with the sector, which yous are the sector. I know there are others out there, but yous are primarily the people who've been driving this, and then make those changes, including protections in law. So that's my first question. And my second question is, in terms of the work that is needed to happen, and working with the commissioner and working with the office, I'm assuming that you were involved in helping to write or develop what the commissioner should be doing and the roles and responsibilities of that commissioner within the sector.
Chair, I suppose in relation to two questions, half a loaf's better than no bread. So we take the progress that's there, and look to see what we can do with it. And that's why one of the things that we've raised with the committee is the need to monitor the effectiveness, because monitoring the effectiveness and where the issues are coming from will make the case for change if change is needed. And I think we're going into this exercise in the expectation that change will be needed, and that it will be something that we would be lobbying for. But we appreciate, legislative change is not something that happens every day, so there will be a long period of time, we would anticipate. But we're interested in making progress in relation to it and seeing what can be done. In terms of sketching out the remit of the commissioners, no. So I don't know what the position is in terms. I don't know whether you're talking about specifically around kind of job descriptions and things like that? Is it that level of detail, or is it more the powers you're talking about?
No, it's certainly not that level of detail, Ian. I think your skills and expertise would more be in what you expect from an Ulster-Scots commissioner, rather than in terms of the powers, the remits, what you'd like them to do, and rather than job descriptions and stuff like that.
Really, what we would like to see the commissioner doing is pushing the envelope. We want the commissioner going around, knocking doors, talking to people. What are you doing for Ulster-Scots? Gathering information. What needs to be done? Where are you in relation to that human rights compliance? I mean, there's been long time issues when things have been raised. For example, with the Department of Education in the past about the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So there's a whole series of articles within UNCRC. UNCRC, of course, is meant to be the underpinning of our education system. And there are specific articles in there about children have the right to be educated in the culture of their community. Children have the right to be educated about the culture of other communities and so on. When people have gone in the past and asked, so specifically, what are you doing for Ulster-Scots to fulfil these provisions? The Department of Education have come back and said, no, you can't separate out. You can't separate these provisions out. We don't gather information like that.
So, Ian, would it be fair to say that you would expect a commissioner to lift the strategy and use that as a way in which to fulfil the functions, and then some other issues that you've raised? That's my final point.
I think, Chair, I would probably want the commissioner to lift the human rights documents first, because actually that's the broadest. That's the base of the pyramid. Start from the broadest and then work your way in. The strategy isn't as broad as the human rights stuff, so I'd want them to start with the human rights stuff and then work their way in. Because potentially, look, I mean, no strategy process is perfect. I was one of the people who was on the expert panel that was involved in shaping the strategy, but at the same time, that was done over a very restricted period of time, with a lot of limitations to the resource that was put in it. So you end up then that what comes out the other end is necessarily reflective of that, of the level of resource that was put into it in the first place. So I wouldn't necessarily use that as the blueprint. I would start more widely and actually want the commissioner to understand how these, particularly if they're going to issue guidance in relation to these human rights things, understand how that is done in other jurisdictions as well, where these human rights things apply.
Okay, thank you. Deputy Chair Stewart, I see you're back online. Do you have any questions you'd like to come in this stage? No. Okay, thank you. So Sinead, please.
I'm not down for.
Oh, you're not down. You're down on my list.
But I mean, I will. I want to talk about human rights. We have struggled to get a bill for human rights into Northern Ireland. It was part of the Good Friday Agreement, and it's always opposed and by the DUP. And here we are, and we're discussing the Commissioner, and it's fundamental, and I totally agree with you, fundamental that we look at the human rights aspect of it. And this is where we run up against the tarmac when we have never been able to deal with it. So it's rather a comment based on your ask, which is not at all unreasonable.
Thank you. Well, thank you. Okay, then Harry, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. At point 5, and you did mention you didn't want any failure to reflect the full breadth of the Ulster-Scots identity. I was just wondering, in terms of Commissioner, would you have a preferred title for the Commissioner? Like a long title or...
To be honest with you, nobody gave me the choice to put the name on it, so I haven't actually sat down and thought about that. mean, put it this way, it needs a lot more thought than other such commissioner, which was where it started. So, yeah, I mean, I think that just it needs a lot of thought. I think there's an importance in making sure, because look, there are, not everybody identifies an Ulster-Scot. It's not compulsory. You know, from my perspective, it's nice, but it's not compulsory for people to be an Ulster-Scot. And there are people out there who identify as Ulster-British. I think a lot of the people who identify as Ulster-British out there do so out of that they're not quite ready to identify as an Ulster-Scot. And I think the reason for that is because there's been a lot of negativity over 30, 40 years, particularly since 1998, about Ulster-Scots, particularly about the Ulster-Scots language. And there's been a lot of ridicule, I'd say, rather than demonisation, which means that has an impact on people. So when people are lifting newspapers and seeing cartoons slagging off their cultural identity, well then they want to find some way to identify, but they're maybe not quite ready to go, yes, I'm an Ulster-Scot. So there is an element of that. I mean, I was involved 20 years ago. There was an organisation in Northern Ireland called the Ulster Society for the Promotion of Ulster British Heritage and Culture. I was on the board of the Ulster Society. My wife worked in the Ulster Society. But it said Ulster British on the tin. When you opened the tin, what was in the tin was Ulster-Scots in the Orange Order. That was the content of what was regarded as Ulster British. So it was a way of defining things that applied very much in a conflict-related context. Now, that said, I think that there's a lot more that could be done in terms of pegging out cultural traditions that are not exclusively Ulster-Scots, that are wider than Ulster-Scots, but nevertheless should be supported and built upon and valued, and there'd be an important role for the Commissioner in relation to the doing of that. So that's a long way round to saying, no, I'm not going to tell you what I think a Commissioner should be called.
Yeah, appreciate it. And also at point 10, it has been elaborated on a bit now, there's a real risk that instead of more human rights protection for Ulster-Scots, we will end up with less. Could you maybe elaborate a wee bit more on the less?
I mean, it's a real, well, I suppose it's not less on paper, but it's less effective. So we're sitting at the moment where people think, oh, well, you've got this new national minority recognition. You're doing really well. And when we were raising issues with the Northern Ireland office, at that stage they were saying to us, well, yes, well, the Irish language people got this powerful commissioner. You got national minority status. But that national minority status hasn't been followed up by anything. No money, no powers, no nothing. Not another word. It's from the day and hour that it was signed in the law. And people in the public sector, nothing going on to raise awareness within the public sector that this thing exists. So we were being told at that stage that, see, once this national minorities thing comes in, like, you can forget about Section 75. You don't need to worry about Section 75 because you've got a whole other. This is your space now. You've got your national minority space. But there's been 25 years training the entire public sector what Section 75 is all about. There's nothing going on to train anybody what national minority status is all about.
There's also a concern because as recently as last week we were talking to people from Cornwall, and Cornwall also has national minority status, and they were basically saying, yeah, it's great, we've had it for 20 years, and we recently tried to organise a thing to sort of celebrate 20 years of national minority status. People don't want to celebrate a bit of paper. They don't see how it relates to deliverable. And what the Ulster-Scots community needs to see is how is something relating to deliverable. That's, plenty of kind words, plenty of, yes, this is going to happen, this is going to happen. But, the actual delivery is you know, what's your saying? Plenty of jam.
Plenty of jam round the mouth, not too much jam in the mouth. That's not mine, that's a Morris Morrow original. So, I mean, the issue is, as well, that, you know, so it's a public sector knowledge. There's also a capacity thing within the sector. Mm-hmm. So there is a very well developed capacity within the Irish language community. They advocate, you know, advocacy, policy, so on. There's a lot of resource has been secured in relation to that. You know, that resource hasn't been available within the Ulster-Scots sector. So, you know, there are not, you know, there's not a CAJ, for example, advocating for the Ulster-Scots sector. So that's a gap. Now, everybody knows the gap's there. The gap's been repeatedly highlighted. But that then becomes an issue that if you've got human rights protections, but what you need to do then is you have to force people to apply them. You know, whereas I think what we would have been hopeful of was a situation where if everybody knows that these human rights protections exist, and they do, or they should, then you shouldn't have to go around fighting the public sector to get them. The public sector should be working to give them to you. And so it shouldn't become a combative thing. What we would like to see is a cascading down of the awareness that these protections are there and that things need to happen. But I mean, we've raised some of these things for years. The European Charter for Regional Minority Languages, there's meant to be an interdepartmental group that oversees the implementation of that. The interdepartmental group hasn't met since 2016. And this gets reported up through, through TO, but into the Committee of Experts, into the Council of Europe. Everybody knows this is happening, but you know, I think at this point people are now waiting for, rather than fixing that, people are now waiting for the Commissioner to come along and fix it. But as we've already highlighted, the Commissioner hasn't necessarily got the teeth to fix it. So you know, you're waiting for something that's maybe not going to come.
Yes, go ahead.
You're on the links with the US and your agency. How do you see the Commissioner being able to strengthen our links with the US?
It's going to require some creativity, because particularly as that's cultural heritage, that's genealogy. Is genealogy covered under language, arts and literature? So the difficulty is you end up kind of cutting off big opportunities. And then, I mean, sometimes people say to us, like, why do you obsess with America? Why do you like the American stuff so much? Two reasons. One, because our cultural identity is recognised much more in America than it is at home. So people you get President Biden standing up talking about the Ulster-Scots and the Scots-Irish. That doesn't happen domestically. But the other aspect of it is everybody here loves America. Yeah. So America has a cut through in Northern Ireland that other things don't have. It has an appeal in council areas that are not, not to put too fine a point on it. It gets a lot of traction in mid-Ulster. It has an appeal. The American stuff has an appeal, and that's it cuts across. Where it is a unionist, unionist controlled council area, nationalist controlled council area, there's a broad appeal. Everybody wants to do American stuff. It makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Sorry, just before you go on, that interdepartmental working group, that's to look at the European Charter or the Framework Convention?
European Charter.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, thank you.
My understanding is there is no mechanism
No,
currently to
okay.
look at the other.
I just took a note to raise it in the next session. So Emma, go ahead.
Thanks very much, Chair, and thanks to you both for your.
Hopefully that wasn't horrible offence.
I don't know what the intention of that comment was, but I'll let it slide as a Mid-Ulster rep. So I suppose I want to ask. Sort of Harry nearly touched on one of the things that I wanted to ask around the whole tourism opportunity and the whole cultural heritage piece, and that came across very clearly in your paper. You know that's almost lost, and I suppose the whole origin of language, and like I am from South Derry and Mid Ulster, I use an awful lot of words on a daily basis that have came from Ulster-Scots. My granny was a McRae. Her mother was a fluent Irish speaker. Like all of these things coexist. You know, her next door neighbours growing up were Ballantines. So like a lot of these things are maybe at times I feel that people put them in a box and think that you know you're one thing, so you cannot have any appreciation of another. And I find all of that fascinating, and I do feel. What you said at the very start there really resonated around the sort of ridicule and the minimisation of, you know, Ulster-Scots tradition and heritage, and I don't feel that we are giving it the value that it should get, and that opportunity particularly. Now I know the point you were making there about the American thing, but it's very topical, I suppose, at the minute with the election of Trump and JD Vance and him talking about his Scotch-Irish and Ulster-Scots heritage and all of that. And the whole thing is fascinating, I think, and there is, you know, there's a gap there. In terms of local tourism opportunities and what you're doing at the minute in Belfast, is there more that could be done there in terms of the Commissioner's work, you feel?
The tourist opportunity is there, there's no question about it. The ideal thing would be for the Commissioner to be fully behind the work of the Ulster-Scots agency and the Ulster-Scots sector more widely, because I mean the sector at large is it now. I'm saying the sector at large. The sector is not large, but the small number of organisations that there are all looking at different ideas of how things can be progressed in relation to the American space. So I think it's counterintuitive, the idea that the Commissioner would have no role in respect of that, particularly whenever one of the things I think that there's been over time is the desire among people who operate in a cultural space to demonstrate the worth of what they do in economic terms. So one of the things that you're always looking to try and do is talk about, well, we can support the tourism agenda, we can attract visitors. Visitors equals money equals investment and blah 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 blah. And that's become really fundamental. That people don't look at arts in as an end in itself. Increasingly, people look at arts as a means to an end. What are the outcomes that are delivered through that space? Whether those are health outcomes or whether they're economic outcomes or social outcomes. So people are looking at it in a wider way. I mean, maybe there's an opportunity for the Commissioners to use some of that thinking to try and kind of apply it into the space. I guess, look, one of the questions that I suppose where the rubber will hit the road on this is the question of whether TAO as the sponsoring department, FMDFM as the sponsoring ministers, will be looking to broadly or narrowly understand the remit of the office, and if people are looking to pin the office to the dot and the cross on the legislation, if people are willing to be more kind of purposive in their understanding of what people are trying to do, well then, who knows what might be possible. But the reality of it is, if there's a strict interpretation put on the legislation, well then you just won't be in that space. I mean, in terms of our work more widely, I mean, there's good stuff going on now with Minister Lyons announced a working group that's chaired by Prony, which we're involved with. National Museums is now on it. Hillsborough Castle and a range of other kind of public sector organisations trying to work on plans for 2026. Look to see where resources can be secured from. So there's a big opportunity for that. We are working on plans ourselves at the minute, obviously in the context of the cultural hub in Belfast. We would like to revamp the visitor centre that we have. We had a really successful project last year where we had an original American Declaration of Independence brought in from London and displayed in Prony. We would love to see, and the Public Record Office in Kew has got 3 Dunlop broadsides, so Dunlop being the guy from Strabane who printed the Declaration. They've got 3 of those. Why shouldn't one of those permanently be on display in Belfast as the anchor in a visitor attraction, bringing, and the Discover Ulster-Scots Centre in Belfast at the minute is now back up at the kind of pre-pandemic visitor number level, about 6,000 people a year. 3/4 of those visitors are out-of-state US visitors coming in. Now, 3,000 people came to see the Declaration in 3 months. That would double the number of visitors, minimum double the number of visitors coming into that centre in a year, and open up the possibility that you can do longer term marketing, the cruise ship market, hundreds of thousands of people coming in, which couldn't be done last year because the whole, just the logistics of the thing happened much too late in the day. It was tied into the Belfast Agreement thing and so on. But that's the space that you could be in, where you have a hub in Belfast that's telling a story that doesn't get told at OMA, because OMA's doing it's performing a different function. That story could be told in Belfast, and it could be that could be a hub sitting at the centre of a network of, for example, Ulysses S. Grant Cottage, where we've worked with Mid-Ulster Council to redo all the interpretation. We're working with Mid and East Antrim now to do the interpretation at the Chester Al Arthur Cottage. We're going to go on to the Andrew Jackson Cottage as well in Carrickfergus. So there's a whole series of different, a network of things where they're not going to be the Ulster Museum, they're not going to be the Ulster American Folk Park, but they've an important part to play in bringing visitors into a local area and actually spreading the tourism piece out. Because what you're getting at the moment, to a great extent, is visitors are coming in. Americans are coming in through Dublin. They're either doing the Wild Atlantic Way and going up around the west coast and then coming into Derry, Londonderry to do the Causeway coast, or they're coming up the east coast. They're missing the bit in the middle. And also, the like of the cruise ships are coming in. They're jumping off onto a bus up the Giant's Causeway. Everything's overloaded at the Giant's Causeway. And all the places in between aren't getting a look in. So these local things which could attract American visitors to come and it's dwell time that to talk about. So it's maybe one extra night in an area to look at a few things, but it's not everybody kind of jumping on a bus and then heading home again straight away. Which makes a difference in local communities. And if you could start, for example, getting American tour buses rolling into Collybaggy, that's going to make a difference in a local community, to the wee shops and the bakeries and the whatever it is. If once or twice a week 50 Americans turn up,
might need a translator.
Well, indeed, but I'm sure that's it. The Collybaggy people can tone it down so that the Americans don't understand.
Yeah. No entirely sure that's possible.
Have you another question?
Just one. Thanks for that. You spoke about couching this in rights. In terms of the UN conventions that you referred to and the different rights mechanisms that haven't been properly implemented, as part of a Bill of Rights, we obviously had the process during the last mandate to try and deliver a Bill of Rights for the North, and perhaps the Ulster-Scots, I suppose, sector isn't often regarded as it should be there in terms of minority languages. Do you feel that would be helpful?
I suppose in the round, potentially any legislative provision that's giving effect to rights is going to be helpful to us. So now, am I lobbying specifically for a Bill of Rights? No, because I don't by any means know enough about it. But anything that's going to give additional human rights protection or give proper effect to human rights protection is something that we would be interested in, because we're trapped in a space at the moment where, to be fair to them, Human Rights Commission don't have the resource to do everything that needs to be done. Ulster-Scots Agency doesn't have the resource to do everything that needs to be done. The Commissioner will have resource to do stuff specifically around this human rights piece, but actually not a broad enough remit to do it. So that's one of the things that we would need to try and do, is kind of put together almost a safety net where the Ulster-Scots Agency and the Human Rights Commission and the Equality Commission, all of the people who have a role in respect of human rights, are working together to try and make sure that Ulster-Scots doesn't fall down through the cracks. Because at the moment what happens, I think, with a lot of these colleagues is that they answer the voices, the people who are crying loudest. For the child that cries loudest is the one that gets the attention. The problem is the Ulster-Scots sector doesn't have the resource to do the advocacy and policy work and the campaigning that other people are resourced to do, which means then that you end up in a position where you're the child that doesn't get fed.
Okay, thank you. Brian, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ian, David, for your attendance and your paper. In terms of the functions of the Commissioner's post, I think you're right to highlight wording where it being restricted to language, arts and literature, that is going to miss out on large aspects of Ulster-Scots culture and heritage. Certainly the two Commissioners don't need to be worded the same, and I think it's important. And each culture will have different strengths. I think the language side, on the Irish side, is going to be a much stronger theme. I think language is important in Ulster-Scots too, but I think it'll be stronger and a more dominant aspect on the Irish side. And I think Ulster-Scots for years was just seen as like Ulsterisms, and was seen as like John Pepper books and things. When we were growing up, you'd have seen Ulster sayings and Belfast sayings, and only later, realising the history where those words have come from, and we all use them to some extent, and particularly as you're saying with the diaspora, and particularly in America, and as Emma said, J.D. Vance and others who clearly, and I meet many American groups visiting Stormont here, and I regularly give them copies of books from the Ulster-Scots Agency, and they always gratefully receive those. In terms of paragraph 16 and cooperation with the Ulster-Scots Agency, you're saying that in New Decade New Approach, the cooperation with the Ulster-Scots Agency was specified, but you're saying that didn't make it into the bill to the same extent. What role have you had to date? Have you had a role in the wording? Have you seen the wording for recruitment of the Commissioner? Have you sought a role in that, or you're shaking your head so that they haven't been given that role?
We haven't had that role. What we were asked to do was nominate somebody to participate in the process. So in a sense, it's not, we have an involvement in the process, but it's not a hands-on involvement. So we nominated a former member of former chairman of our board to sit on the interview panel. Right. That's the extent of it. but I mean, obviously, look, it is a recruitment process. So I mean, these things are kept tight. So I mean, we're content that we've been asked to nominate somebody. We've nominated somebody. That's fine. We trust them to get on and do whatever needs to be done.
And so you're not sure at this stage whether the Ulster-Scots agency is specified in the paperwork relating to the post?
Well, I suppose what we tried to do at the point where this was going through Parliament was, and I suppose it's it will come down to the intention of government and the policy, more so than the specific detail around kind of putting a commissioner in place. The effectiveness of this. It was raised in Parliament. Ministers did talk about a need for the things to work very closely together, and we will certainly be appealing to that whenever we're talking to commissioners. We have certainly discussed that with TAO officials as well. Not recent. I mean, we've had over the course of the implementation phase, we've probably had two sit-down meetings ourselves in Foras with the branch and TAO to talk about this. So, but that would have been, I suppose, the last of those meetings a couple of months ago. Sorry, go ahead.
And finally, just from our time, we can ask the officials coming in shortly, but have you been given any time scale for the advertisement of the posts?
I'm anticipating an advertisement potentially late this year or early January.
Yeah.
But more detail than that, no.
Okay.
That's just my sense of it.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Okay, and Claire, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ian. I suppose really the points I'll raise, many others have raised them before me as well. And I suppose what I'm hearing and what I would have assumed is that it nearly feels like Ulster-Scots has had a bit of a PR problem in terms of really advocating and communicating, the value that it has, not just to Northern Ireland, but the island, indeed the British Isles. And I wholeheartedly agree with you that we need to look at this beyond a language. We need to look at this in terms of heritage and place names and arts, and even our own origins. And it's frustrating to an extent that we even we have language around well, the other side gets this and we don't get that, and I appreciate that there is a reality in terms of the resource that's allocated, and it's almost a catch-22 that you can't advocate unless you have the resources to do that, and then when you do that in itself would nearly snowball. And I agree with other comments in terms of North America and the opportunities there, and I do feel like even the conversations around Ulster-Scots in North America are happening more frequently, and how do we maximize the opportunities with that. And I think even just the connection with the Irish language community as well, because there's a lot of overlap in terms of the Gaelic Isles, of the UK, if you like. And you mentioned Cornwall, that's another one. So, I to me, this shouldn't be a tick box for one community over the other. To me, there's a real opportunity to look into our past and our heritage, and where we come from. And like on a personal note, I'm Ulster-Scots. I live in Korean. My granny was from Dublin. My dad was from England. My family was from Scotland. And I don't know much about any of those backgrounds and history and all of that. And it would be nice if we can nearly set aside the politics around all of this stuff to get to a place where actually it enriches all of who we are. And I'm 100% hearing you that the commissioner therefore can't be limited. And I would love to see the commissioner make the role their own. And similarly, with Irish language and Irish culture as well, and work together and really, maximize those opportunities. So I suppose if there's a question in there, it's how do we do that, and what do we as a committee or even individual MLAs have to do to support you in advocating for what you see as the potential, but an awful lot of people just see as politics.
Big question. I think getting us to a position where everybody's looking at these things in the most helpful way possible, in terms of trying to understand that things like the American stuff are really important, because people who are unsure about whether to embrace an Ulster-Scots identity, what we try to do is lay out for people a picnic. You imagine if you go on a picnic, you lay out the blanket, then you put all the stuff down, the sandwiches and the pies and the sweet stuff and all that. Ulster-Scots is a picnic. There's all sorts of things in it. You don't have to eat everything on the blanket. You can pick and choose what you want as your entry point in the Ulster-Scots. The sandwich you want to eat first might be the American sandwich.
Yeah.
But that
I
then
think
can
that's really
lead you
probably
on.
it all.
Well, yes, I'm no stranger to if I supper myself. But you don't want to narrow down the number of entry points that there are for people to engage with a much wider cultural identity, and that's one of the things that's in danger of been done here. That you end up losing, and it's not because we're kind of fascinated with America. We want people to buy in to an Ulster-Scots cultural identity.
Yeah.
If the fact
Well,
that they have family in America is
America's fascinated with us, and it's it is beyond even just the Irish identity. It's people resonate with what matters to them and their background and their history, and I'm hearing a lot of people who really want to hear that, and but it doesn't necessarily exist, from this context, or it hasn't really been, the story hasn't been told in ways that it has in from other perspectives, and I really do think there's a huge opportunity, even for more Ulster-Scots Centre. I would love to see one up on the North Coast, in the homeland, and I there's opportunities with C.S. Lewis and everything, so
there's a really exciting there's a group of folks working on a really exciting looking project in Castle Rock.
and that's my constituency, so I'm aware of that.
But again, that's a project where people are looking to develop something which is faith-based, though. So there's a strong faith element where they're talking about C.S. Lewis, they're talking about W.F. Marshall, they're talking about Christian heritage. So Ulster-Scots is writ through all that.
Yeah.
But actually, you're potentially saying, but the commissioner can't have any role in supporting a thing like that because, is C.S. Lewis's Christian writing excluded from being interested in that, the work of the commissioner? There's the space where you suddenly get into. I mean, and by the way, on the diaspora piece, it's not just America. We've actually got a conversation ongoing at the moment with folks in New Zealand, because next year's the centenary of the death of W.F. Massey, who was the New Zealand Prime Minister from up your way, who are interested in loaning his personal items belonging to Massey. There's a Massey University in New Zealand. We could be building connections between Massey University and the University of Ulster at Coleraine, doing heritage projects, but the Commissioner's office has nothing to do with any of that.
Yeah. Well, if you need an advocate, I'm happy to help with that. So we should connect at some point.
We will follow up on that.
Sure.
Okay. Well, I think we're really just reached our peak in time because we have two more panels this afternoon. But just want to thank you both, gentlemen, for your attendance today. Lots of questions there for our next session, but we hope that maybe once the Commissioner is in place, then you'll come back maybe and we'll have this conversation ongoing. But for now, thank you so much.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Okay, members, take your ease for a little minute. I think there were a couple of actions coming out of that in terms of what we...
Committee Room 29.
Secretary of State, the primary legislation in Westminster, I think there are issues there in terms of that duty to have due regard to. So we'll see what the rest of the afternoon brings forward. Anything else anybody wants to say at this stage? No? No. Okay. Okay, members, moving on then. So we've got our next session. It will be a departmental oral briefing. You'll find the clerk's brief at page 26 of your pack and the departmental briefing at page 28. So are they there? Okay, thank you, gentlemen. Sorry for keeping you waiting a few minutes there. We're just finishing off there. So you're very welcome both to this meeting. So members, we have Richard Irwin, I think most people know you as Ricky, Director of Equality, Rights and Identity at the Executive Office, and Owen Mullen, who's Head of the Language Commissioner's Branch. So thank you for your briefing you sent in advance. Direct and to the point. We appreciated it and in good time. So do you want to make some opening remarks and then we'll go to questions?
Okay, thanks very much, Chair, and good afternoon. And thank you for the opportunity to provide this briefing to the committee today. So yes, members will have received a short paper setting out the background and an overview of how we as a department are working to implement the provisions within the Identity and Language Northern Ireland Act 2022 for which TEO is responsible. I'm especially pleased to say that both the First and Deputy First Ministers have agreed to progress these appointments and have instructed officials to prepare additional advice to enable the competitions to be launched, and I'll provide further detail on this advice in due course. After ministerial review and consideration of our initial submission, a number of key recommendations were agreed to, so namely that the appointments process would reflect the principles and practices of the Code of Practice for Ministerial Public Appointments here, the governance and accountability structure of the Office of Identity and Cultural Expression, that 3 separate competitions would be run, one for each respective body, the makeup of the selection panel for each competition, and the use of HR Connect to carry out the administrative aspects of the selection process on behalf of the department. So we are at an advanced stage turning these decisions into meaningful actions to take this work forward. The briefing paper has provided some of the background to this work so far. I'll give you a brief overview of the provisions of the Act for which TEO is responsible. Part 1 of the Act places responsibility on the First Minister and Deputy First Minister and TEO to jointly appoint and establish the 3 new bodies. It provides for the national and cultural identity principles and also places responsibilities on other departments. It also provides for the Irish Language Commissioner, the Commissioner for the Ulster-Scots and the Ulster-British tradition, and the Director and members of the Office of Identity and Cultural Expression to be appointed jointly by the First Minister and Deputy First Minister. Schedules to the Act make provision in respect of the structures of each new body itself, including staffing. In respect of the national and cultural identity principles, there is a new due regard duty created by the Act, which is placed on specified public authorities when carrying out functions with reference to a person's religious belief, political opinion or racial group. I'll set out briefly the provision the Act makes in respect of the 3 new bodies. So, with regard to the Office of Identity and Cultural Expression, Part 7A of the Act sets out the functions, aims and powers of the Office. Those functions are to promote awareness of the national and cultural identity principles, monitor and encourage compliance with them, and report to the Assembly in respect of compliance. The Office may issue guidance in respect of the new national and cultural identity principles, undertake or commission research into matters relating to national and cultural identity, and it may also provide grants to persons. With regard to the Irish Language Commissioner, Part 7B of the Act's purpose is to provide official recognition of the status of the Irish language by providing for the appointment of an Irish Language Commissioner, providing for the development of best practice standards relating to the use of the Irish language by public authorities, and requiring public authorities to have due regard to those standards. This is in addition to any other official recognition of the language, including, for example, Irish medium education and strategies provided under Section 28D of the NI Act. The Act states that this provision does not affect the status of the English language. The principal aim of the Commissioner is to enhance and protect the use of the Irish language by public authorities when they are providing services to citizens. The Commissioner will also monitor and promote compliance with the published standards and investigate complaints. In relation to the Commissioner for the Ulster-Scots and the Ulster-British tradition, Part 7C focuses on the Ulster-Scots and Ulster-British tradition, and in particular makes provision for the creation of a Commissioner. The Commissioner is to be appointed by the First and Deputy First Minister acting jointly. The Commissioner's principal aim is to enhance and develop the language, arts and literature associated with the Ulster-Scots and the Ulster-British tradition in Northern Ireland. The Commissioner must promote awareness of Ulster-Scots services provided by public authorities and provide or publish such advice, support and guidance as the Commissioner considers appropriate to public authorities. The Act also makes other provision related to the responsibilities of other departments. It provides for the repeal of the Administration of Justice Language Act Ireland 1737, which falls under the remit of the Department of Justice, and it also places a duty on the Department of Education to encourage and facilitate the use of Ulster-Scots in the education system. It's important to note that the Department for Communities remains policy lead for languages and culture and is taking forward the development of strategies for Irish and Ulster-Scots under 28D of the NI Act 1998. DEO officials are progressing the appointments process in line with Ministers' decisions. It is envisaged that work in Year 1 will focus on the recruitment and appointment of core staff, the members of the Office of Identity and Cultural Expression and the 2 Commissioners. Further work streams include seeking classification of the new bodies with the Office of National Statistics, scoping options for support for the new authorities, including IT, HR and accommodation, and the finalisation of the selection panel. Our current focus of work is finalising further advice to Ministers, which will enable the launch of the 3 competitions. To inform this advice, during the summer, officials actively engaged with the key stakeholders in the Irish language and Ulster-Scots communities with a view to securing panel members for the upcoming competitions and seek their views on the appointment process. Ministers have committed to following the principles of the Code of Practice for these appointments, and with that commitment there are additional factors that need to be taken into consideration in terms of governance and accountability. As we move ahead, we continue to strengthen our work by liaising with and drawing on the expertise of other TEO colleagues. And that concludes the opening remarks, Chair. So happy to take any questions that members have.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure, did you hear anything of the last panel there? No. Okay. Okay, I see. I think maybe we'll write to you just to sort of outline it then in greater detail around the remit for the Commissioner against what the Ulster-Scots Agency and the European Charter, etc., are looking at. So we could maybe put that in writing to you. But can you just give me a bit of clarity then? So we've got 8 public appointments. So we've got the Director of the new Office of Identity, Culture and Expression, 5 other members, the Irish Language Commissioner, and then the Commissioner for Ulster-Scots and Ulster-British Tradition. What organisational structure will sit under them? I'm really trying to get a sense of how many more bodies are going to be added into this.
Into each office?
Yeah. So
okay, so some of the preparatory work that's been done over the last wee while is in relation to the outline business case, which includes looking at the options for the core staffing structure for each of the offices. That involved looking at other similar commissions as comparators. So the option that has been agreed through the business case and through the Department of Finance is that the initial core staffing will be 10 staff each for the Irish Language Commissioner and the Ulster-Scots and Ulster-British Tradition Commissioner, and 11 for the Office of Identity and Cultural Expression. That, however, is an initial staffing structure that will allow the offices to be established and commence their work. However, once those offices are in place, they will want to draw up their own business and corporate plans, and will then look at more detailed defining of what their role actually is, and that might require reviewing the staffing structure to determine if more or less staff are actually required.
So that's quite a lot of mouths to feed. So are we clear about what they'll all be doing, and also have you looked in the current financial constraints? And we've just heard from Ian Crozier from the Ulster-Scots Agency there, for example, they have that great building in the middle of Belfast City Council. Have you looked to maybe incorporate the Ulster-Scots Commissioner into that, or for them to provide some backroom staff in terms of payroll or whatever it is?
There has been some work done in terms of looking at IT, HR and accommodation options.
Yes.
There's nothing settled yet. Our focus, to be fair, has been on the public appointments process and getting the competitions started. We will look further at the options around accommodation, and of course, if there are viable options across the estate, then we'll work with Land and Property Services and DOF on identifying what is the most appropriate accommodation.
Okay, so we know the commencement regulations came in May 2023, okay? And then what happened next? Then we had the First and Deputy First Minister come in February 24 this year, and then they signed off. I'm trying to find my notes here. They signed off then in May. So, knowing what has happened in Wales and other commissioners' offices, what have you been doing if you're just really looking at the appointments process?
There's been a significant amount of preparatory work. So obviously the business case itself is a major piece of work, but given that these are ministerial appointments, obviously we can only go so far in terms of the level of work in the absence of ministers. Now that ministers are back, the initial set of advice agreed that we could take forward the competitions, which is excellent. So the work around that has been looking at draft competition booklets, the person specification, the criteria, working with HR Connect to agree how the process of the competitions would actually be delivered, looking at some of the options around IT, HR and accommodation. So there's been a significant amount of work to get to the point that we're at. We also, during the summer, we've engaged with the language bodies around trying to identify panel members for the 3 competitions. Each competition will also have senior civil servants on, so we've finalised the panels as well, which took a bit of time. Owen, is there anything else?
We also looked at the governance and accountability structures of each of the organisations. If you look, if the Identity and Language Act provided for up to 5 board members, so there was consideration in the structure and the governance arrangements with regards to OIS and how many members were required. We looked at looking at ONS classifications and a number of things to put the foundations in place to enable us to deliver now.
Okay, so when was the Identity and Cultural Expression branch set up, and when was the Language Commissioner branch? When were they established?
We were established in 2020 to take forward the 3 bills amended to the NDNA. So in 2020 to for roughly around 18 months, we were a bill team taking forward the amended bills. Due to COVID and a number of other matters, it wasn't progressed within that mandate. Okay. We were then moved on the other tasks for a while, the travel agent scheme. Both branches were responsible for in light of COVID. Yeah. And then following that, it was the progression of the bill by the NIO, and off the top of my head, that was December 22. Okay. And then, as you say, the commencement regulations were made in May thereafter.
It's fair to say that the amount of progress in the last short number of months has been huge compared to the overall time frame from 2020. So there's a level of momentum now, which is great.
Good. Last one for me then. So the Ulster-Scots agency brought to our attention there, the Act does not create a duty to have due regard and respect of the public authorities. That role wasn't given to the Commissioner. And they tried to have the legislation amended, and I remember the NIO guarded the drafting of that legislation so tightly. Have you made representation to the NIO and the Secretary of State that the legislation at the minute is not fit for purpose?
No. Okay. Focus of the work has been on the implementation on the legislation as it stands, which is that TEO has to establish the 3 bodies and make the 8 public appointments. And ministers have agreed that approach.
Okay. Stuart, online, can you hear us, and do you want to ask some questions? No. Okay. I'll go to Carol then. Thank you.
Thank you for that. So, Ricky, see, in theory then, I hear what you say about the ministers have agreed the whole process thus far. So it sounds like I'm trying to be hopeful here, but it sounds like the appointment of these commissioners could very well happen before the end of the year. That's my first question. And then, in theory, the work of the commissioners, for example, if the commissioner for the Ulster-Scots was to recommend legislative changes, then that's up to he or she to bring that forward as part of their work, in the same way the commissioner for the Irish language could make recommendations on the standards set for public bodies on the use of language. Am I correct in saying that?
So, just a broad timeline of events from this point onwards. We have held our initial panel meetings, which is great. So two were on the 8th of November, one was on the 22nd of November. So the panels have looked at the draft criteria for the posts. We have a series of amendments to make to the criteria and the booklet before we can go back to ministers. Our aim is to get the next set of advice to ministers before Christmas, and that would include the adverts, the competition booklets, the criteria, and so on. It's then over to ministers in terms of consideration of that documentation. If with a fair wind that's agreed in the new year, my hope would be that we could commence the competitions in January, and that timeline would then lead to interviews probably around the March period, and then potentially appointments would follow after that. Depending on who's appointed, there may be a notice period for those individuals. So that's the broad time frame, Carol. In terms of the second part of your question, yes, I do think it would be a matter for the commissioners themselves, and indeed the Office of Identity and Cultural Expression, once they are established and the personnel are in place, that if they feel, having consulted more widely with the sector, that there needs to be further change to the legislation, that will be a matter for them to bring forward to TEO and FM and DFM. So I think the legislation does allow for that.
So that's, Chair, just the follow-on question from that was my concern, because there was a lot of work put into both the Irish language strategy and the strategy for Ulster-Scots culture and heritage, right, in 2015. And as you rightly said, they're going through DFC. But the understanding was always that once the commissioners were in place, that any changes, including perhaps legislative changes, that once the commissioner recommended those, then that's what the position is. They're doing it on the basis of evidence or gaps or whatever. So I'm actually quite relieved to hear that, because I think the concern was that because the British government, when they brought some of the legislation forward for the Ulster-Scots, that it was quite skewed and left little room. But my understanding from what you've said, and if I'm not representing you, feel free to say so, is that it's up to the commissioner when he or she is appointed and those gaps are brought forward by the commissioner for change, then that's the process for those changes to happen. Is that correct?
So it's not specified in the legislation explicitly like that, but it's also not specified that can't happen.
No, exactly.
So what I would say is, if that happens, it would be a matter then for ministers to determine if they wish to accept those recommendations and act on that. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Timothy, please.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks very much for your presentation. So starting off on something you've said, can you just outline what the current status of the English language is in Northern Ireland, and is it defined in law anywhere?
I wouldn't be able to answer that, Timothy. The languages policy sits with the Department for Communities.
But what I would say, Timothy, is that under both the Commissioner for the Ulster-Scots and Ulster-British Tradition and the Irish Language Commission, Commissioner, within the legislation, it does say that nothing in this part affects the status of the English language. So that whatever the status was prior to the enactment of the legislation is still the status of the English language.
Moving on then to the clerk's brief, under G, as stated here, repeals the Administration of Justice Language Act Ireland 1737, which requires all court proceedings to be in English. I suppose my concerns with that are, has there been any work done with DOJ and the impact this would have on our courts? Are we going to have translation in all our courts? What's the anticipated cost of this work?
So that's nothing to do with the Executive Office. That's a matter for the Department of Justice for when those provisions within the Act are actually commenced, and that's a matter for NIO. So NIO has not commenced those provisions yet, but I know that NIO has engaged with DOJ on that.
And there's been no conversations between the Executive Office and DOJ on that?
Not that I've been involved in.
It's a matter for DOJ. It's outside of our policy remit, so it would be for DOJ and the court service to take forward. The provision is for DOJ, not for the Executive Office to take forward.
It's similar to the other provision in relation to the Department of Education's duty to facilitate Irish medium education, Ulster-Scots education within the education system. Again, my understanding is that has not been commenced, and that will be a matter between NIO and DE.
And the clerk's briefing as well talks about the establishment of the Castlereagh Foundation, either by the Office of Identity and Cultural Expression or the Secretary of State. Is there any progress in that?
No, because it is for either the Office of Identity and Cultural Expression or the Secretary of State to establish the Castlereagh Foundation. So the sequence of events that we're working to is that we will establish the office first. When the office is established and the members are appointed, it then becomes that office's responsibility to establish the Castlereagh Foundation, or the Secretary of State can step in at any stage and do that.
Has there been any discussions about Craigavon House going forward? Or is it a case of once the office is up that might be a discussion that can be introduced at that stage?
That would be a matter for that office to discuss, but I haven't been involved in any discussions around that.
That's grand.
Okay.
Okay, Brian, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your attendance. Earlier on we were hearing from the Ulster-Scots agency. They felt the agency had been left out of the wording in the bill. I don't know if you got to hear their submission, and they hope that there will be close working cooperation between the Commissioner and the Ulster-Scots agency, and that will be reflected in the wording for the post, so hopefully that will be the case. They also highlighted that previously they had always spoken about language, heritage and culture, and the wording now seems to be about language, arts and literature, and that a lot of their work is in the area of heritage, and in particular in their international work, with people who from the Ulster-Scots diaspora around the world, and that's a big focus of their work, particularly when people visit here and then trace their family roots. So again, just making that point, and hopefully that will be reflected in the wording, that heritage aspect. If it is restricted, the wording is restricted to language, arts and literature, I feel that will not embrace a major part of Ulster-Scots. I don't know if you have any comment on that.
Well, just to say that I think it highlights the importance that our panels actually include people from the sector with knowledge, and that representation is coming from either current or past members of both North-South language bodies. So as a panel, we are discussing the criteria and its appropriateness, and we are in that process now, and it will ultimately be for ministers to agree the final criteria for those posts. So the voice is being heard on that.
Okay. And in terms of the Commissioner, can you confirm that the Commissioners will not themselves have legislative powers? If there's any suggestions or recommendations they want to bring forward, that would go through the normal political process.
Brian, I think the Act itself clearly defines what the purpose of the Commissioners and their offices is, so that is their powers. If there's to be any change to that, as I said earlier, they can make representation to ministers, and it will be for ministers to determine if they wish to act on that.
Yeah. So that'll be part of the normal
I would have thought.
Process within the critical powers of the Assembly and ministers. Yep. Okay, that's all for now, Chair.
Okay, Sinead, please.
Actually, you've covered my questions, because my questions was about the core staffing, and you've covered that quite well.
Okay.
And the other areas that I wanted to talk about was the governance arrangements, and you've also covered that. So yeah, you've covered everything. Thank you.
Emma, please.
Thanks, Chair. I'll be brief because Chair has covered it, and Carol, from what I heard of the answers, has perhaps covered a bit of it as well. When do you think the commissioners will be in office? Time frame?
Yeah, no, the timeline I set out before, it's dependent on ministerial decisions. It would be great if we had commissioners in place by the summer.
Summer?
Yeah, and that is probably with a fair wind, because purely of the steps that we have to follow in the code of practice for ministerial appointments.
Best case scenario, summer?
Yes.
The guidance does say between 9 to 12 months following ministerial decision, but we are administering 3 competitions at the same time in parallel, so naturally there is going to be complexities involved in that, but with clear wind we would hope for summer.
It's obviously dependent as well on the candidates who apply, on whether they meet the criteria, on the number of candidates that we submit to ministers, and obviously on ministers' decision around those candidates for each of the appointments. So there's quite a lot of factors there at play.
Okay, I actually wanted to pick up on that point. I don't know whether you would feel comfortable answering it, but when we saw the draft legislation way back, we were concerned that there may be an occasion, and it was for Emma and Michelle and Emma, that they can't agree who to appoint. And is there a provision within the legislation that if they can't agree, that the Secretary of State can step in and intervene?
So what I would say about that is the legislation is quite clear on the ability of the Secretary of State to step in terms of either doing something that a department or a language body hasn't done.
Yes.
But as to defining what that actually is, probably would require legal advice,
okay.
I would suggest.
Okay.
Now, in the scenario that you're talking about, the other option, of course, is that we go back out for another competition.
Okay.
And there is precedent for that. I've been involved in previous public appointments around, for example, victims commissioners. So there are options there.
Okay, and I think Timothy wants back in, but just another question. So we're talking about the Director of the Office of Identity and Cultural Expression, 11 staff. Where does that sit with the role for the Community Relations Council? Is there potential overlap? You know, are you going to be scaling back that funding? What swim lanes will they be in?
Yeah, so we've done a bit of analysis around where potential overlaps would be, both with the language bodies as well, ECNI, CRC, OIS, as we call it for short, will have that grant making function.
Yes.
So obviously there's potential there for duplication. Again, that's a TEO arm's length body. So we're in a position where, if needs be, we can negotiate some kind of memorandum of understanding, have very clear rules and responsibilities about what the purpose of the funding actually is. Okay. I think the legislation is helpful in this regard because it says that the funding that OIS provides has to be to bodies of a similar nature in terms of the purpose of promoting the national and cultural principles. So that's quite clear. There's a wee bit of room around that, whereas Community Relations Council funding is more in the good relations space, but there will obviously be some close interplay there, so there will be further work to be done around that.
Right.
Owen, did you?
It's in the grant making functions in line with the aims, not the national identity principle, just before we get shouted afterwards.
That's okay.
What I would say is it's a shared space, but if you look at each of the statutes within rights, language, identity, we have CRC, we have ECNI, we have a number of different bodies. Yeah. But when you actually look at their statute and their terms of reference, each one has a different focus and scope. So what we'd be hoping to do is work with each of those bodies to get a clear space and minimise overlap.
Just on that, so it's ensuring compliance by public authorities to have due regard to promoting awareness of the national and cultural identity principles. Mm-hmm. What does that mean? Like, what are national and cultural identity principles?
Principles are defined in the legislation,
Okay.
and it will be for that office.
I mean, what does it look like? You know,
Well, I can read them out if
no, but I
if
mean,
you
what does it mean in practice if we've got this body with 11
Yeah.
people plus commission?
I think that's part of the work of the office once it's established in terms of how is it going to deliver its legislative and statutory function. It will need to determine how best to do that. It will need to engage with the wider stakeholder field to determine how best to do that. It may look at how does the Equality Commission for Northern Ireland actually deliver against its statutory function and decide to do something similar. But there is further work to be done around the processes and the how on some of this.
Okay.
And we're not looking at that now. We are more interested in get the bodies established, get the public appointments done, and then that work can be taken forward.
Okay, thank you. Timothy?
Thank you very much, Chair. And just in response to your question, I've been doing some Googling, some research. Can you point out where in law the status of English is set out? If you can't do it today, is that something you can come back with and answer to your own in response to your own? It says this doesn't make any change. But I can't see an act anywhere that sets out, you know, what
Just-
official language.
Just to clarify, Timothy, I said the Act that states that nothing in this part affects the status of the English language. Just repeating what's
if it
within the
doesn't
Act.
have official status, and now Irish does have official status, does that mean it would be elevated above English, Northern Ireland?
Irish has the official recognition of the status of the Irish language in Northern Ireland, but that's that. Nothing in this part affects the status of the English language is what's within the statute.
Yeah. So what act sets out what the status of English is?
So again, I don't think that's something that we can answer now. I think,
I don't think it's codified in law because it's...
and I generally don't know is the
Yeah,
answer.
We explored this, we've explored.
Well, is it something you can come back to? The
We can take it away, absolutely. We can take it away, and we probably will need to consult with DFC colleagues who have ownership of the languages strategies for the executive. So
But I think it's important just to clarify.
Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, no, well, I think it is. It's relevant to have clarification. I mean, English obviously is the working language of the country, and it's a language that everyone speaks, unless they've come from another an overseas country. So it's important that nothing takes away from English as being the working language of the country. And I would hope, furthermore, okay, that there would never be a requirement unless it was a specific post. But for routine jobs in the civil service, there should never be a requirement that people have to speak Irish or Ulster-Scots in terms of their day-to-day work for most ordinary jobs. But I don't know whether you can comment on that.
well, I don't know that there's a question there for me to answer other than really how the commissioners deliver their functions will be a matter for them once they're established and up and running. So we're not in the space of determining how they will do their jobs at this point.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much and good luck in getting this pushed forward because we're all very keen to see these offices established. So thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Cheers.
I was going to take a 5-minute comfort break if that's okay, and we'll be back in 5 minutes. Okay, thank you.
Committee Room 29. Sound. 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 Committee Room 29, 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 Sound.
So thank you. So we're now gone live again, members. So we're now moving on to item 8 of our agenda, and we're going to take an oral evidence session from Foras and Gaeilge. So page 36 of your pack, you'll find the clerk's brief. Page 38, you'll find the briefing paper from Foras and Gaeilge in English, and then after that, then you'll find it in Irish. So welcome to the meeting, Mr. Sean O'Kane. Okay, Chief Executive, and then Mr. Paul Deeds, who's the Deputy Chief Executive. So, members, you are requested, Foras and Gaeilge have requested the evidence be given in Irish. So, if we are content to go ahead and put our headphones on, and then I will now ask yourselves to provide your evidence. Thank you.
Speaker. First, I would like to thank you, the committee, for inviting us here to speak, and we're delighted to have this opportunity. And the second thing I would like to say is to say thank the Professor Regina Colleton wasn't able to come today. She lives south of Dublin, and because of her responsibilities over work, she wasn't able to come today. So she would like to give her make her excuses. So I'd like to tell that to you. The third one that I would like to do is to make reference, as the chairman said, to a short reference to our primary statement. I will not go through the entire statement. I think you've had an opportunity to read the whole lot, but to draw your attention to our mission and our vision, our mission that I have, to increase the use of Irish language in every day and to normalise it and to share the cultural wealth of the Irish language throughout the Ireland, and it should be normalised among the general population, among both jurisdictions, and to promote awareness of the cultural richness of the Irish language. We have a long list of responsibilities under the legislation, and I would draw your attention to the second, which is number 7b, and that is to advise governments. I think that that's one of the most important responsibilities that we have, and in the context of today, the most important that we have is to advise governments, especially since we're here in the committee. There are plenty of opinions with regards to the new legislation. That was we were informed of that in the evidence, and that we sent you. And apart from go through that evidence in its entirety, perhaps I would just draw your attention to a few things that I believe that I would like to highlight in that evidence. First, I would like to thank you that we have an interpretation service, because our vision and mission, this is one of the things that we are trying to develop, north and south, that we use that the use of Irish language should be normalised in society, and people should be able to do that without any difficulties. People should just know that they can use the Irish language, that it's natural for them. So thank you for making that easy. The first point that we have in our evidence is that it deals with the hope that we have for the legislation, that the legislation will succeed to take Irish language out of politics as far as possible, and to break the link between political opinions that people have and people's to distinguish between people's political opinions and their attitude towards the language, because we are generally seeing in today's society that a wide range of political opinions can be shared by people, but they may not be in the same mind with the Irish language, but they should have an opportunity, no matter what their political opinions, to use the Irish language. So I want to make that point. The second thing that I would like to draw your attention to is that culture, nationality and language and identity are not the same thing. People might be very interested in the Irish culture and the Irish language, or people from the nationalist population, or even the Republican community, who might be interested in the Irish language. But a lot of Irish speakers who are not particularly interested in politics, who are not interested in aspects of the culture or inheritance of Ireland, but who would like to use their Irish. And that's two of the points that we would like to highlight. We would like to see a split, a difference made between those things in society and with language rights and with those people who use the Irish language regularly in their lives. As I say, I will not go through the whole evidence because you have it available, and perhaps we would just be happy to take your questions as you would like to ask them. Thank you. I should like to introduce my comrade. This is Paul Deeds. Paul is Deputy Chief Executive in Foras na Gaeilge, and he is in charge of education matters, and he is has his office in Queen's University in Belfast and in Dublin as well. Paul, do you want to say something? I'd just like to thank you, as Sean said, and for coming here today and to give our evidence and to share our opinions with you about these important matters.
Thank you, really appreciate that. And I should have highlighted at the start, I think this is our first committee meeting in Irish, so it is actually quite a momentous day for us as a committee, so I really appreciate your time here today. I just want to pick up on your paper, and you talk about that the Irish Identity and Languages Act does not include language rights in terms of education, public services, signs and opportunities to use it. What difference would that make, and what can we do as a committee to support you in that pursuit? Because I know this is a long-standing ambition of the sector.
Insofar as we are talking about language rights and use of Irish, I think we have to be very careful about the context with regard to minorities. Whenever we are talking about a minority language side by side by a world language, it's very difficult for people to have opportunities to use their Irish language. Very often they use Irish at home, but when children grow up and they don't spend that much time at home anymore. And it is very important as a society that we can give and afford opportunities to young people and to everybody to be able to use Irish, and that they feel at comfort using that Irish. If people cannot find ways and opportunities to use Irish, they will lose their language skills. So a language is not the same as heritage. For example, our built heritage, buildings and old relics from the Stone Age, they will remain the same. But we don't have to be able to use them for them to remain the same. But if we cannot use our language, it falls into disuse. And we see that very clearly today in the south, in the Irish, in the Gaeltacht areas, in Donegal, Galway, Cork, and Kerry. As those opportunities that the community have, who have been using that language for 3,000 years without a break, but as those opportunities fade away, young people are losing their language abilities. The language has been lost to a certain extent here, but we are trying to reanimate it by giving people those opportunities. And just to add to that, Chairperson, normally
mar sin de tan curthaige seo eisceachú ar bhealach.
The translation there, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Did you catch that?
If we could repeat that last point, please. With regard to protecting that language,
that's why it's important.
is important in terms of language rights, because the large international bodies set down that that we have to protect languages by giving people rights, and it is an exceptional the way we are operating in this part of the world. Thank you.
So, in your evidence session there, you talked about how the Welsh model was set up and the independence of the Commissioner from the... So you were sort of talking about the need for independence from the First Minister and Deputy First Minister. But in terms of actually advancing it through government, we sort of needed to be embedded in there. So I wonder, could you speak a wee bit to how you feel that there needs to be a bit of distance, but also it being at the heart of government at all? That makes sense?
I think the view we have, and this comes back to one of the first points that I made, that it is important as far as possible that when we're talking about any rights, language rights in this case, if we were talking about rights for people with disabilities or rights for any other minority group in society, whenever they become so tied up with politics, we have difficulties then, because we start getting bogged down in political questions, and those rights are mixed up and with political issues. And we see, we understand that in the office of First and Deputy First Ministers, we are looking obviously all the time at the divisions between us, and we think that it would be much better if we could be, if this could be, this language issue could be left with the Commissioner, the Language Commissioner, and if this was based on international best practice. There's nothing new here, and in other parts of Europe, this is something we see regularly in Europe and throughout the world, following international best practice. We understand the ways this should play out. This issue has been sorted out in Spain and Wales, where they have more than one language, and in Canada and other places throughout the world. And we think it would be much better if we left this issue to the language expert in the Language Commissioner's office.
Just want to pick up on the point around the depoliticisation. So I coach hockey down in Carrickfergus, girls who are 11, and a lot of them go to Irish dancing, and you can't get a place, like there's a wait list, but obviously they're from a unionist, primarily unionist background. And when the Ulster-Scots agency were in earlier, they were saying, you know, it's almost like a picnic, you know, not an entryway, but you know that there may be parts of Irish culture. But if you're to reach across the political divide, so to speak, you know, something like Irish dancing or other parts of the culture may be a way in which people might want to explore the language, but you sort of made the point you think that they should be treated separately. So I just wanted you to talk to that. Thank you.
Yeah, I suppose the point that we were trying to make there is that interest in the Irish tradition and culture and, for example, music and dancing and other things like that, that is not the same as language rights. You are right, and completely right, that it is a very effective way to giving people opportunities to dip their toe in the water, so to speak, and to maybe get a taster of some of the Irish language and maybe some of it to learn. But there is a difference there between that and giving Irish speakers a chance to use their language. Whenever I was growing up, as someone who wanted to use Irish in my life, I had to fight against the state to get recognition for the Irish version of my name, for example. And that left me that I felt that I wasn't really part of that state for a long time. I now have grandchildren who have been brought up with Irish. They are receiving their education through Irish. They feel completely part of the society here. And if their rights are denied them as they grow up, and I hope that they will feel that they are not part of the state anymore, and I wouldn't like them to feel that. And as I would like them to feel as part of the state and society as Irish speakers. So maybe there are people like yourself who would like to learn some Irish, and I welcome them. And I, for example, my own grandchildren, and I hope their parents don't mind me mentioning them here. We're looking to protect their rights and abilities to feel part of the society. And if I could add to that, very often interest in Irish tradition also encourages interest in the Irish language, and that's how I started. As you know yourself, there's an Irish group in South Belfast have been using this to bring together people from all across the community to encourage interest in Irish. We have to see that the language stands on its own 2 feet. One of the things about this legislation is to facilitate people using the Irish language, and we see groups that are linking up between Irish language groups in the unionist areas and in nationalist areas throughout Belfast and Derry. It is sort of important that we deal with the language as a piece of the culture in and of itself.
Carol, please.
So, Gormaga.
Thank you, and you're very welcome to the committee today. Firstly, I would like to say that I think I understand the thing that Paul was saying. I don't like using the phrase of depoliticising the Irish language, but anyway, I have a couple of questions for you, simple questions. Supporting language planning outside of the Gaeltacht. Firstly, could you give us an update on First na Gaeilge's Scéim Pobal Gaeilge Fund, and if you intend to offer additional funding to grassroots groups, first of all?
Yes, so
with regard to Scéim Líonraí Gaeilge, I think that's what you mean. That scheme is it not a 3-year scheme, and we are now extending that scheme, especially because we have budget restraints in Foras na Gaeilge, and so that scheme will be opened up again. But in order for that to happen, we will have to provide individual grants to groups. For the year 2027-2028, we will be looking at. We recognise that the individual grants provided to groups at present isn't always enough. There are 3 steps to the scheme. At the basic first level, we have groups who don't have a grant for an Irish language officer. The thought behind that is that people at that base level are able to move on to the secondary level, and so those community groups the base level will be able to, as I say, advance to the second stage now. But we haven't the funding at present to accept any more groups at the basic level. With regard to language planning, we have Irish networks, 5 language networks in total throughout the island, 2 of them in the north. We get grants from the government in the south, and we get a subvention, a limited subvention from the southern administration for the 2 networks in the north, but that is not enough at present to give those 2 networks a fully funded grant. Therefore, we give them extra funding for 6 months to those groups in the 2 northern networks, and we hope that we will have more funding in 2025 that we'll be able to add another 6 months to that funding at the right level for the 2 language networks in the north. I'm not sure if that answers your question. Yes, thank you very much. And I understand that money is needed, and I understand the context. At any point, how are Foras na Gaeilge supporting language planning development in those areas where there is need and growth? Instead of rather than on a geographical basis. For example, the Gaeltacht area in Belfast, and outside of the Gaeltacht area in Belfast, in other areas throughout the north. If you could speak to that, Sean and Paul. I'd like, with the first way we support groups with regard to language planning is through our schemes in general. I mentioned that the most important thing here was advising governments. The second most important thing, or maybe even the most important thing according to your viewpoint, is providing funding to community groups. There are 25 schemes that Foras na Gaeilge have, and in any one year we give out around 400 and 500 grants, and they go out to community groups to the most part. So, for example, summer camps, youth activities, extracurricular, and for example, festivals, both minor festivals and major festivals. We provide for opportunities for people to get Irish literature, for example. So we have these different schemes outside of the Irish language networks. And within the Gaeltacht quarter, we have 5 or 6 groups in the major Gaeltacht areas, which get yearly funding from ourselves, and in 3 yearly funding from us as well. And then we also provide funding for other groups and Irish centres. The Irish language centres are very important because they provide an area where people can come together and use their language. And for people who are learning Irish and who are maybe reluctant to speak Irish publicly in case they make a mistake. But whenever they come into an Irish language centre, they have a conversation circle, and they have coffee, and there's maybe drama groups, maybe play groups for and this is all through the medium of Irish. Yes, so we provide around 16 Irish language centres throughout the country, and 12 of those are in the north. So really the north is very developed with regard to Irish language centres, and we provide funding for the two Culturlan in McKeldum O'Fee in Belfast and the one in Derry. Culturlan Ecanan in Derry City, which do great work. Thank you very much indeed. Those are my questions. Thank you, and the best of luck. And if I could say a few more words. You are right, Carol. We have to emphasise the importance of public community work and work to promote Irish at community level. As you know yourself, I've been working for 20 years in an area of deprivation, and one of the I saw the effect that Irish language work had on that community, and in encouraging employment and the economy in those areas. And the leadership of Foras na Gaeilge are really determined to pump more money into these areas, but we need to get budgets and budget lines opened quickly. Because if we don't get that, there is a danger that the momentum that we have built up will be lost, and that momentum allows other groups to prosper. We don't want to lose that head of steam that we have built up in those areas.
Go home.
Yes, I do agree completely with you, Paul. We need a greater budget for language development, language planning and things like that. I do understand the way things are, and you understand the way things are. We often speak about these matters at this committee, but we need to focus on the importance of the language.
But the work that the commissioners will hopefully complement with Foras na Gaeilge will be brought forward. So that's me, Paula Gormagov.
Thank you, Carol. Sinead, please.
Okay. Thank you, Sean and Paul, for your evidence today. And I have to say, sometimes things happen and you don't realise the progress that you've made until you're actually sitting here. And I'm very pleased to be sitting here. I'm not an Irish speaker, but I do appreciate the beautiful language. And to sit here and listen to evidence be given in Irish, and the facilitation of the interpretation here, and the respect that it has been given within the context of this assembly and the executive is progress. So I'd say that at the outside, and I just, it's remarkable between the emphasis in which you want the separation, between cultural identity and language. The emphasis from your evidence is on the language, and we had a previous presentation from Ulster-Scots, and I suppose the emphasis was on the cultural, and that is very, very rich and to be welcomed as well. And the previous, the previous presentation that was given as well, there was a concern over the human rights aspect on the protections of the identity and language. How concerned are you about the requirement of the Act to restrict the human rights based on the sensitivities of others, and have you thought through of any practical implications of that?
I think we recognise that issue, and I think when we come from a background of an organisation that deals with language, we are of the opinion that we aren't really happy, and we wouldn't be happy in any other area of life to accept a restriction of our rights. As I mentioned at the start, if we were talking about rights for disabled people, rights concerning LGBT community, we would never even dream that we should reduce those rights, because it would maybe annoy somebody else if they saw something or heard something linked to those minority groups. Today, I don't think people have the right anymore to be not to be insulted, and that's, I suppose, the easiest way I can respond to you. I understand that there is a history here, and there's a baggage linked to the Irish language. It's not a very long history, but it is. We're talking about a history that from the last century. Maybe if people went a bit further back in history, they would see a very different picture, I think, with regard to the Irish language. But at the end of the day, the opinion is that the people have rights, and as soon as someone has a right, and that is recognised by the UN, the UNESCO, by the European Council, and other international bodies of the likes, we should not be restricting those, or indeed denying those rights, because they don't maybe sit well with other members of the community. And again, if I could come in, what Sean has said has been recognised by all the international bodies, the UN, the European Council, the International the Commission for Human Rights in the North of Ireland. It has been recognised with regard to Irish rights, and nobody has a right not to be insulted.
Often there's been a great deal of discussions in the public forum and media about Irish signs being desecrated and things like that there. So it's been weaponised, and therefore you would assume that we, on a human rights basis, that we protect those that are being targeted through your use of a language. Do you feel that your voice has been heard throughout government, not just within the context of the executive office, but in other government departments? Do you feel that we have more work to do?
With all due respect, I think there is still a lot to be done in order to develop the Irish language. I mentioned the Gaeltacht areas, that Irish has been there without a break for 3,000 years, and that was the same throughout this island. And if we, as a government in the North, if we don't take responsibility for the Irish language, for the development and promotion of the Irish language, who else is going to do it? The Spaniards aren't going to do it, or the French aren't going to do it. If we ourselves, the people of Ireland in the North or the South, we had the Irish language here long before the political structures we have today. So I think the government here has a responsibility, the same responsibility they have with regard to environment, the built heritage we have, which damage has been done to. Well, the growth of English as a global language, we're not trying to stop that. But it is creating challenges for minority languages like Irish, and we have it is incumbent upon us as a government to protect and put protections in for the Irish language in the education system. most of the people in the north of Ireland, not only do they not learn the Irish language, they don't learn anything about the Irish language. And we have a whole community of young people who are growing up in this society who have absolutely no knowledge of the Irish language. I think that we're doing them a disservice. I think we as a government have a responsibility when we are preserving something that was here for thousands of years, that we should be allowing our young people to know that something about this language. So I definitely do think development has to be done more so than has been done to date, but it really goes through all levels of government. Enough has not been done with regard to Irish language arts, the Irish language community. You heard us speaking whenever Carol Nicolin asked us about the different support that we provide to groups. We aren't able to keep up with the demand on our services. We have to deny community groups. Groups that are in disadvantaged areas who want to organise events for young people for the most part and for other people of course too, and we cannot do enough to we can't provide for them. So we should be doing an awful lot more at the local government level, at the educational level, and at the different government levels too.
Thank you, and just a shout out to the Culture Land in Derry. They're doing great work, and they're packed at the doors, particularly on a Saturday morning with young people.
Because actually just must figure them
and the bookshop right in front of the Little Acorn Books, I think that's the name of it, right in front of the they won a prize in the South for the best bookshop, not only the best Irish bookshop, but the best bookshop on the island. And there are many Irish books in there too, and we are very proud that the way they have treated the Irish language. The owner of it is actually learning Irish at Preston, and she is very happy to have Irish books on her shelves.
Jenny is very, very proud of her one. I was overseeing her on Saturday afternoon. She was delighted.
Okay, thank you. Emma, please.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, and thank you for being here today. This has been a great day. I'm sorry, my Irish isn't great, but I know that broken Irish is better than tricky English, so I am. But I will continue in English.
In your presentation around the objectives of Foras in terms of the normalisation of Irish and the utilisation of Irish, and I suppose when we look, like what you said as well, is about the depoliticisation of Irish, and obviously, you know, when we look at Conry and how they started, and the Gaelic League and the involvement of the likes of Douglas Hyde and other people of different faiths across the country at that time in the Gaelic revival and bringing the language back to the fore, and the work you're doing now. And it always strikes me, because I have great shame about my lack of Irish. My mum is a native speaker from Gaeilge Lar, and her mother, they spoke Irish exclusively at home, and my granny in Donegal always spoke in Irish until she left the house. So it would have been all Irish, and then they would have landed into a shopping centre and immediately switched to Berla, because there was great shame if you were speaking Irish, you were poor and you were whatever. And I was speaking during the earlier presentation about my granny on my other side, who was a McRae to her own name, but her mother entered primary school pre-partition as Moira O'Cleary and came out of it as Mary Clark, and that was it. And the whole thing I find fascinating in how all of it is linked, and that heritage, and how we, you know, recognise where place names come from, where all of it is so linked to our lives, whether or not we recognise it. And the area that I represent, there's a town near me where some people, for very cynical reasons, and from my perspective, objected to Irish language signage in Tobermoor. And I thought it was quite ironic, because when you translate Tobermoor to Irish, you literally get Tobermoor. There was a big whale somewhere in Tobermoor at a time. But it's that if people were maybe aware of those things, there would be less threat felt or less opposition to it. But the work that you're doing in terms of the normalisation of the language and how important that is. And so in our own end, we have Glór Bernie and obviously Anne Carn that you're heavily involved in. And I suppose if you would speak to what you've seen in the time that you're working for Foras in terms of the growth of the language in areas like that. Like, we have a massive Irish language community now in Ballinascreen, Gaeilge that's flourishing. When I was going through school, I didn't have that opportunity. It's something obviously that I regret, but yeah, you can see in such a short time the progress that has been made.
Thank you very much. And your Irish is very good. Don't be making any excuses for your Irish. One of the signs, the strongest signs that we have with regard to the promotion of the development of Irish is Anne Carn in South Derry, that we have a Irish language community, and we are now seeing that young couples are moving to that area to raise their children because there is an Irish language community there, and they can see that the Irish language is normalised there, if I can use that word, in everyday life. They have Irish at home, in school, in the youth club, in the Mogi club, football club, wherever, at the youth club, and everywhere around them. So that is one of the main differences that we see. We saw things like that in Belfast, the Shaw's Road Gaeltacht, for example. Now, it's different whenever you're dealing with a city. And Pobble and Carn, the An Carn community, really took their inspiration from the people in Belfast to set up their own community. The second thing is Irish medium education. If we look at College de Fersti here in Belfast, with more than 1,000 pupils, that number is gone up year on year, and we see the same thing in South Derry, in Dungiven, where we have Irish medium secondary school, which opened 60 years ago, and it now has more than 300 students at that school. When I was speaking about political points earlier, these young people are growing up. They really aren't interested in the political aspects of the Irish language. They want to be able to use the Irish language in their life. And you will get the full range of political viewpoints and everything else throughout that 2,000 students in the secondary level. And they are people who will be young couples with their own children in the future, and I hope that they will have a very positive outlook on the support that the government here gave them with regard to the Irish language. The government is trying to develop the Irish language in the north. It has been said in different statements. And one of the most basic things, whenever a government is saying to people that they would want to support them, one of the most basic things they can do is to speak to them. So those young people want to speak to the state, want to get services from the state, and we would like to see them to have the opportunity to do that. It won't happen in every service, but certain basic services certainly will be able to cater to those young people in the time ahead. And so that's why I'm happy to see that we have this legislation, and that we will have a commissioner, and that we will give a recognition to all those people who want to use Irish in their daily life.
As a follow-up to that, you've sort of touched upon it there, that whole idea of Irish being, you know, a house language, and something that at one stage was obviously being completely wiped out in big parts of the country, but even in your Gaeltacht areas where it was only seen as something that you used informally and not something that was useful to you. How integral is the role of the Commissioner and the work that's going on here in bringing that, I suppose, professionalisation of the language and making it an extra string to someone's bow, and you know that it is something that they can use in their career or something that they can use in their professional lives?
Language preservation and language development are very complex issues. UNESCO have a drawing which show the different areas of life of a language, the areas that are essential in any country or in any community where a language can have vitality, and we can ensure that vitality. And you cannot develop one aspect of a language without developing all aspects of that language, because it would be having a three-legged stool. If one of those legs is missing, the whole thing falls apart. Similarly with the Irish language, if we leave one aspect out, the whole thing falls apart. We mentioned the Gaeltacht areas. They are under pressure, although they have Irish medium education, even though people are able to speak Irish in the homes, because the Irish language is not preserved outside of the schoolyard, and English is encroaching. Young people are growing up in those areas, and they are using more and more English than they are Irish. Over time it gets easier for them to use English than Irish. And that is one example of how complex language development is. So going back to your question, development of communities is essential, and the status of the language is essential. That people see that the language actually has a status. Something, for example, that wasn't about whenever your grandmother wanted to speak Irish. The language had no status. And as well as that, the visibility of the language, that's essential. If the language isn't to be seen, people never think of it, and they never think of using it. And then we have language rights, that people can speak to the state, to the local government and government bodies through Irish, and they will recognise that my language is respected. Not only does it have status, we have a choice to use English or Irish, and therefore I will not lose my language skills because I'm not using it every day. People like myself and Paul use Irish every day. We aren't going to lose our language skills. We're very determined, and we can't expect everybody of those 2,000 students in College de First and in the other Irish medium schools would be of the same opinion. They shouldn't have to be like that in order to use their Irish language. They shouldn't have to make such an effort so that they don't lose their language rights. Really, the language journey should be easy for them. Thank you very much.
Okay, Timothy?
Thank you very much. A couple of questions. I suppose I want to start off with the term on page 40, paragraph 4, depoliticisation of the Irish language, and you have indeed mentioned throughout the duration of your evidence session. You've talked about keeping Irish language out of politics. I was listening to the BBC travelling to work the other morning, where they were discussing the meeting at Belfast City Council. It was Monday night, where they were talking about there was a decision to rename, after the Boyne Bridge has been dismantled, they were going to rename Boyne Bridge Place. And there was a Sinn Féin member had raised at the meeting that because they didn't raise any objections to the naming of Boyne Bridge Place, that unionists should no longer object to Irish signs. Have you any comments towards that? Because once again it seems to be that Sinn Féin believe there should be a trade-off, and that is one way in which the Irish language is being politicised. And to be honest with you, the big cheerleaders for politicising the Irish language is indeed Sinn Féin for the unionist community.
That's probably a more appropriate question for me.
Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
It's here. I suppose the way we look at this is we think it's much better discuss language issues based on the needs of people who want to use that language, and we should not try to discuss the language in political terms. We are realistic. We recognise where we are and the different opinions that exist, but we do believe if we treat the Irish like a language that was used here for 1,000 years, and out of those 3,000 years, we have 100 years whenever it was under pressure, under language stress, and therefore hasn't been used and is not being used and is not seen as maybe it once was. We now have an opportunity to look at that 3,000 years and really make an attempt to see Irish as something that belongs to us all, to all our communities. And so I wouldn't be of the opinion that we should mix it up with issues regarding identity, a British identity, Republican identity, nationalist identity, Irish identity even. I think it is a heritage issue and something that belongs to anybody who is on this piece of land in which we live, and we should look and deal with it in that way.
For Foras and Gaeilge to move forward and to help depoliticise the Irish language, is it not in your best interest to call out those that are weaponising the language?
I think if we did that, we would do that. We'd be doing that every day, because something happens every day from somebody somewhere to try and keep Irish back, to try and make use of the Irish in a particular way. And as a state body, we don't have a role in condemning people for their opinions, but rather try and get them to understand the importance of the Irish language as a language. And we believe that that is a role for the political leaders that we have, really, to be speaking out whenever attacks are made against the Irish language, and to ensure that such attacks don't happen, and to condemn them when they do happen.
Moving on to paragraph 6 of your submission, you say you're concerned, it goes on to say the sensitivities of those with different national and cultural identities are taken into account. Why would you be concerned about taking other people's concerns essentially into account?
So styling, well, we believe it's not that we don't want to think of the sensitivities of others, but whenever we put that into legislation, we would be concerned that it is enough to show that you don't enjoy Irish to prevent the development of Irish. And as we said earlier, we don't believe that people have the right to be not to be insulted by hearing Irish or seeing Irish. We don't believe that has anything to do with with rights, and I don't think it'll do any harm. And so when we see a sentence like that in legislation, I think it gives a statutory protection to people for a reason that I don't understand, that if they see Irish or hear Irish, and then because it's in legislation, that they would be able to then prevent the use of Irish or indeed Irish being visible in society. So that's the concern that we have with that point.
From that, do you see a conflict between seeking to suppress any opposition to Irish language to your preferred cultural expression while others are regulated in a divided society?
I'm not sure if I understand your question, but I don't see any conflict. I don't think we're trying to suppress any other culture or suppress any other language rights. I wouldn't agree with that. We wouldn't agree with that. In so much as we are an organisation that is dealing with language progression, we would not like to see that any other language is being suppressed or any other culture is being put underfoot. So I don't think that is the way we would approach this. We don't see any conflict between promoting and developing the Irish language, and we don't see that you could understand from that we would be trying to suppress any other language or culture. I think we can do promote both languages and both cultures.
Yep. So going back to paragraph 6, and that's where that led from, where you were raising that you are concerned about the sensitivities of those with different national and cultural identities are taken into account. From that, it appears to me that you're trying to suppress those that have an opposition to Irish. Obviously you dispute that, but that's the way that it reads to me. Paragraph 8 of your evidence talks about discrimination against Irish speakers. And I suppose in general terms, what can I do that you can't? And how do you feel you're being discriminated against?
With regard to your first question, I think that is the reason why we would like to make a difference between political outlooks and cultural outlooks and language rights. I don't think they are the same thing, and people can have very different political outlooks and still use the Irish language. And by tying the cultural matter to the language matter, it's not helpful. With regard to things that you can do that I couldn't do, for example, with a state, you can, with regard to Irish, you can live your whole life through English with any interaction that you have with society and with the government, local government and national level. Of course, I can't do that. And I suppose that is the difference in the rights that you have as a language user of English and as a language user of Irish in my case. I think really that is what you meant to ask.
And I suppose that's fair
But
enough.
we have a couple more to get
Yeah,
in.
I just finished with one comment that your biggest obstacle within unionist communities to Irish being accepted or tolerated is certainly, as I've said, is Sinn Féin and how they've weaponised the language. And until you try to combat and stop them weaponising it, I find that you will have a very difficult task for Irish to be accepted in unionist areas.
Okay, I'm going to move on. Brian.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your attendance today. Certainly I understand the desire to preserve all minority languages in a world where minority languages are in decline. When I speak to people from other parts of the world, where even within one state there will be 100+ languages, and concern is those are declining. And I view Irish in the context of a group of 5 Celtic-based languages in the British Isles, or a group of 6 if you include Breton in Brittany. And so I recognise that those are indigenous languages and minority languages. In terms of 3 issues I want to put to you briefly, my concerns about the legislation is first of all the cost to the public purse, that we cannot duplicate all public services in Irish, or linked to that being a situation where it is made a requirement for normal civil service jobs that someone that needs to be able to communicate in Irish in case someone was to speak Irish to them, and they would be expected to be able to converse when actually everyone who speaks Irish can also speak English perfectly well. So I understand the desire, and you've expressed that, to live your life as much as possible through the medium of Irish. But do you recognise there's a limit to how widely that will apply in terms of cost to the public purse?
Yeah, it's Gaeilge.
I think I recognise the issue of cost, and a few things about that. I mentioned earlier when I was speaking that I think the 2 governments have a responsibility on this island to ensure that Irish is preserved, promoted, and if we don't do that, who else will do it? And the Northern government should not be leaving those responsibilities completely at the door of the Irish government. We have our own responsibilities as part of the UK and as a language of the UK, as is recognised in the European Charter, to promote that language. Whenever you do that, it's going to cost money. But it is a cost, a valid cost. Whenever we want to protect any rights in society, there's a cost to that, and that's a cost that we should be happy to stand. We can do that in a planned way to reduce those costs. There's not a big difference whenever you when you, for example, set up a website, whether it's bilingual or monolingual. But if you wait until the whole site is completely up and running and then translate it, it costs more money. So, for example, we're talking about TransLink. We made that point to them whenever they're making their new transport hub in Belfast, that if they could cover the Irish issue now at the planning stage, it would be much cheaper. The second thing I would say, how widespread can we expect this bilingualism to be? Well, this is a journey, and we can't expect overnight to have 100% bilingualism. But we have to start in those places where the Irish community are using, and then we can work on that, and we can look then at the Welsh approach, which is much more advanced than the situation here in the north. Even over in Wales, not everything is bilingual. So in the south, where the Irish language is the first national language, not everything is provided bilingually there either. So it is a journey, and bit by bit we will achieve our ends. I have still not met an Irish speaker who can speak English, and so therefore, because of that, people with Irish can use, of course, English language services as well. So again, as I say, Rome wasn't built in a day, so we can add services bit by bit without huge extra cost for the taxpayer or the government.
Okay, thank you for your response. And one other question, Chair, just on the whole issue, the politicisation whole issue, and I mean, you referred, Sean, in your own life to your desire to use the Irish version of your own name, and you had to make a stand for that, and seeing that as your own identity and your cultural identity, and people have that right. But I'm sure you will, when that becomes part of a community identity, and when people have different identities in community, then it will become a contested matter. And I have seen that. I was for 12 years on Belfast City Council, and perhaps I met you at some stage during that time. And I mean, I have to say, I do resent where Belfast City Council got to on the Irish street sign legislation, or for a second language street signs, where a single councillor or a single resident was able now to commission a survey of a street and only 15% approval. And that has led to division within areas and to resentment when at such a small threshold for decisions to be taken. And that has made the language politically contentious. So, I mean, my view is that where the Irish, if I call it the Irish language lobby, where it has the political majority to make changes through, and in that case it was the nationalist parties and the Alliance Party, reduced the threshold so far down, but it has caused resentment and division in areas that were quietly mixed, and also in areas where actually there was only a very small demand. And there have been surveys carried out which, because a councillor or a single resident requested it, and the outcomes were very low level support and they weren't approved, or even that councillors have accepted when it came to committee that actually there's no prospect of this being accepted. So it's to say that even when there's a political support on an elected body to make something happen, it's not always in the best interest of promoting the Irish language if it's seen as forcing something through against the level of opposition. And another example I would give, and I know we're told it's a Gaeltacht quarter in the Mid-Falls area, but when that was defined by councillors, Sinn Féin councillors primarily in Belfast, and they've taken the boundary to be the Springfield Road. And I've said from the start when this proposal came up that from Spring Martin Road to Lanark Way is very much a mixed area, Spring Martin, Highfield, West Circular Road, and a whole number of organisations in that area, and to therefore declare that area being part of the Gaeltacht is not realistic, where that is not the cultural identity or therefore political identity that people ascribe to or see themselves as having. And then recently, with the Fourth Meadow Community Greenway, and it was agreed there would be different language policies for different sections, But in terms of Springfield Dam, which is a shared facility, and I regularly run through it, and I see people from both sides of the community using it. And if anything, it should have been trilingual signs, but it was pushed through politically that it would be English and Irish only, not Ulster-Scots. So decisions like that, where there's the opportunity to be more accommodating, and not to impose just because there's the political backing, that would help the Irish language lobby community, if I can call it that, not to see the campaign as being political. But when unionists see it being forced through by nationalist parties and often with the backing of Alliance, then of course they're going to see this as being foisted on us as a cultural identity which many in that community, in the unionist community, do not subscribe to.
Yeah, so look, Anya,
I recognise the context that we are living in here. I suppose I don't like repeating myself, but I think the government and local government have a responsibility towards the Irish language, because this is the only place that we can do this. It won't be done, as I say, in Spain or in the different European countries. This is where the Irish language has been spoken, and this is where it has to be developed. A point I made earlier, the importance of separating the Irish language from cultural identity and questions of political identity. In a way that you put your question, you're saying that there are people who in different communities that would have no interest in Irish, and that Irish would indeed annoy them if they saw Irish. And we deny...
Sorry to interrupt, but when their street name is been translated into Irish, then they see that as cultural branding of their street and of their area.
I guess it's Gaeilge.
And Foras na Gaeilge's opinion is that we have a complete separation between the language on the street signs and questions that regard culture. As we see in East Belfast, where we have East Belfast Mission, they are people who have a specific cultural identity, they have specific political identity, but that is not the same as the identity they have that relates to the language. Whenever we say that we must depoliticize the Irish language, I suppose we're using it with a small p, if I can put it that way, that we should make an attempt in our society to show that the Irish language is something that belongs to every identity and every culture. And again, back to my point about responsibility, that politicians, unionist politicians, have a responsibility to make that point to their communities, because if we cannot protect and develop the Irish language here, who else is going to do it? And we would lose 3,000 years of cultural heritage, which existed here before any political structures. And I think it's time for unionist leaders to give that message that that the language really isn't anything to do with politics or culture, that it's that you can have your own political, your own cultural identity as a British person, a Protestant, as a loyalist, as a unionist, but at the same time use the Irish language and the Irish to be available in your area. But when we tie the Irish language to politics and culture, we will, as soon as we do that, we're going to have difficulties.
Jugalum just focal coalition brand Neelishan Pobble.
the Irish language does not belong to the nationalist community. It belongs to everybody. And we have said that over and over and seen that over and over years. Where we see difficulties about this cultural branding, international best practice very clear, and the European Charter for Regional and Minority Language is very clear that the responsibility rests with a local government to provide education which adds to good relations, and that is where the problem lies. And take progressive actions to promote the language. And anywhere we see that doesn't actually cause problems. So really, where we have problems, the buck rests with the local authorities.
Just one sentence in reply. As Timothy has done, I would ask you to think about what you have put in paragraph 6, that where you're presenting the requirement to respect the sensitivities of those with different national and cultural identities. That's what I would ask you.
In Savage is gur féidir sin.
Where that can keep progressive steps back, that's the only place that comes into play. We respect the opinions of unionists, but we can't use that as a way of holding back the progress and promotion of the Irish language. And as I say, that is very clearly set out in the international best practice, and this is the practice in all jurisdictions except in this small part of the world.
Okay. Other communities have sensitivities too. Okay.
Just for anybody watching online, the word was not resent, it was concerned, that was used in paragraph 6. Long session, but we've just got one more. Claire, please, thanks.
Gurev Ma Agib.
Thank you very much.
Right. I come from a unionist perspective, albeit I don't really associate my unionist or my position on the Constitution as connected necessarily to cultural identity and language as such. However, I recognise that there are people within the unionist community that might. I admit I personally have no interest in speaking Irish other than respecting those who wish to, and that certainly there are people within my own constituency that's the case, and I'm actually visiting the Gaeilge in my constituency next week to talk about a number of constituency issues, and absolutely have no difficulty with that. As far as I'm concerned, I'm a representative of everyone within my constituency. I suppose, to come back to my point around not really having an interest, I suppose that stems from the fact that it had never featured in my life. To an extent, it still doesn't feature within my life. And the conversations that we had with previous presenters, particularly around Ulster-Scots, is much more, I suppose, relevant to me. And I would say that similarly from a lot of, people that I connect with and know. So how do we engage both perspectives, all communities to try and, I suppose, desensitize what has become a political issue, disappointingly, because I very much see the value and the richness in cultural identity and language, whether that's French, Spanish, Irish, or any other. And similarly, if I was to go to France, I will order my glass of wine in French, very bad French, but I will try to put forward that respect that I think everybody deserves and that entitlement that everybody deserves. So how do we foster that culture? Because I think I think genuinely there are fears and concerns, and it's because people don't know. It's the fear of the unknown. It's the probably the fear of never having engaged, and I mean that right across the perspectives. It's not just Irish language, and it's Ulster-Scots and understanding that as well. Yeah, how do we improve this? And I nearly want to step aside from the legislation. I appreciate that's why you're here today. But to me, I think how we genuinely move forward in a place of respect is that we we start talking to one another, and listening and learning. So just your thoughts on that. Yous are a wee bit behind in my translation, so if I don't respond, then you'll know why.
Thank you very much, Claire. And the first thing I would like to say is to recognise the statement that Claire made whenever threats were made against the Castleknock classes recently. And Claire issued a statement immediately after that supporting those people to have the right to go to Irish language classes, and that they should not be threatened in that way. And I would like to recognise that in the first instance. I suppose because we are speaking to politicians here, one of the main things that we could do with regard to this issue is there should be less worry and concern in the community, in the PAD community, as we call them in general, is if we had positive statements from public leaders. And I go back to this issue that we have a responsibility as a government to promote and preserve this language that has been used here for 3,000 years, and that would help greatly if unionist leaders would be able to issue supportive statements, as you did in the Castleknock case, but in other places as well, without fear. If they could make statements showing to the community that it will not do any damage to anybody if Irish is to be heard, that it will not damage their rights with regards to English language or their right to be British or their religious rights. It will not do any difference or any damage to anyone. And we are only developing a part of our cultural heritage as part of the UK, as we do with Welsh, with Ulster-Scots, with Scots Gaelic. That is the context for what we are trying to achieve here. We have the European Charter, and we mention it regularly. The UK government signed that European Charter, and I think that unionists should be proud of that. That hasn't been signed by the Irish government with regard to Irish language, but it has been signed by the UK government with regard to the Irish language. And for unionists to recognise how important that is, why would unionists not be proud of that point? If unionists in the Scottish Islands are proud of Scots Gaelic, which is very, very similar to the Irish language, especially Ulster Irish. So you asked, Claire, one thing that we could do to promote and put this question forward, I think, is if we had supportive statements coming from our unionist political leaders with regard to the language. In that context, I'm not expecting unionist politicians to make statements about the reunification of the island. I'm talking here that we are part of the UK, that and the European Charter is also something that the UK government has signed up to, and that the Gaelic language, Irish language, is part of the linguistic heritage of the UK, just like Welsh, Scots Gaelic, Ulster-Scots, and the other Celtic languages like Cornish. And I understand, but I don't see why we would not be able to issue positive statements like this, especially when we see the welcome that the people of East Belfast and the people in the Newton Arch Road have welcomed the Irish language without damaging or making any difference to their political outlooks or their cultural identity. They are still British, if that's their outlook, and they are still unionist and loyalist. They're still Protestant, and they are still unionist. And the learning of the Irish language makes absolutely no difference to that.
Okay, Claire? Oh, sorry, she's just... Okay. Okay, so thank you so much. I really, really appreciate your time today. As we said to the representatives from the Ulster-Scots Agency, once we have the commissioners in post, the Irish Language Commissioner, we would really appreciate if you could maybe come back maybe a few months in to talk to us about how you feel it's going and stuff. But for now, I really appreciate your time today. I think that was an excellent session, so thank you.
Thank you.
I guess just Hartshal Norris na Gaeilge.
And on behalf of Foras na Gaeilge, and can I thank you again for the very respectful way we discussed this today, and the very important and interesting discussion we had today. And if anybody wants to meet us to drill down into any of these issues, like Brian or Timothy, we'll be more than happy to meet you. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, members, just want to pick up on just what we're going to do going forward. As I said in the Chair's brief, we will be writing, we've got agreement there to write to the Secretary of State around the Bill of Rights, but whenever, I think it was Timothy, you raised around the Castlereagh Foundation, and I quickly Googled there, and the Secretary of State, whoever it was at the time, in May 2021 talked about setting up an advisory committee for the establishment of this Castlereagh Foundation. So I think that we are people in agreement that we could maybe write, and I also saw that that there was some questions asked recently there, and the response was a bit of a non-response from the Labour government. So are people content that we add that onto the letter then to find out where they're at with that 3 years on, 5, I don't know how many years on? It's okay. Any other actions from today? Any other thoughts or?
There were a couple of things that were mentioned
by
members during one of the sessions.
Yeah.
One was around whether to write to the Secretary of State around due regard.
Oh, definitely.
For Ulster-Scots.
Yes.
And the other one was members were talking about the interdepartmental working group hadn't met since 2016, whether to write to the department to ask about that.
I have that one down as well. Yeah. Okay, no, that's good. Quite a lot covered there.
Members are agreed to do that.
Is everyone agreed then? Yeah. I'm just trying to think if there's anything else there that I thought that the department... Yeah, I actually said to the TO officials that we would write to them because they didn't hear what the Ulster-Scots Agency had to say around that due regard duty, so if we can also maybe get that in writing to them so they're absolutely crystal clear. Is that okay? Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. Okay, so moving on, members, so the inquiry stakeholders event today, thank you to those members who joined. Claire must have scooted up that road because she joined us as well, but I thought it was an excellent event. So thank you to the team here and also to the Assembly Research Service who provided the note takers. So we did say that anybody who was there could still put in written submissions, but I think we're keen that anybody else in the next few weeks, because when I met with the clerk earlier today, I said we would try to maybe have next week's session as a sort of not cut-off point, but at the point at which then Michael and his team then start looking at the draft report with a view then that when we come back after Christmas recess, then we'll have that in front of us, see if there's any gaps, and then try and push forward in terms of putting forward the recommendations and engage with the department. So anybody who was there today, any comments?
Well, I just only had 2 groups at my table, but
Yes.
I was hoping there might have been a few more.
Yeah.
But no, there were useful comments that were made, and I know the officials were capturing them as well. So no, except it's a useful model to involve a lot more groups anytime we're doing an inquiry. It's the first time I've had a session like that, but thought it was useful.
Yes.
Yeah, it was really good. I suppose an awful lot of the discussion wasn't really new, but it was just good to get that all captured and hear what different people's perspective was. So
okay, thank you. So forward work programme members, you'll find on page 48 of your meeting pack. So just to sort of facilitate next week around trying to wrap up the inquiry, again, I spoke to the clerk earlier today and suggested that we would try to have another presentation or evidence session from young people, whether it's the young person's commissioner or some other like children's law centre or something, because I think that voice has been missing a wee bit in this. And if we're able to set up that session, then the potential then to postpone the session under the research into clerical abuse into early next year. It just allows us then that space, because Human Rights Commissioner coming next week, and it's just really to devote the session to the gaps in equality. Are people in agreement?
Yeah, Chair.
Yes.
Sure, I think it would be good to do a bit of a stock take on the HIA and victims and survivors of childhood sexual abuse, and even the memorialisation, because it would be good to put it all together to find out exactly where it's at.
Yes.
We are getting regular correspondence. I'm just aware of maybe the cut-off date in terms of COSIGA and other things like that. Be good to find out where everything's at.
Yes. In terms of a dedicated session?
Yeah,
yes.
Absolutely.
No, absolutely. Were people in agreement with that? Because it's quite a lot to knit together.
Yeah, and there's just different strands to that work, and it's hard just keeping track of it all.
Absolutely.
But I would ask that if we're doing that early in the new year, the clerical abuse not be put back too far as a briefing session, because it does keep coming up, and members may have heard. I mean, there was someone on radio this morning talking about that on Radio Ulster, and very stark, issue, and I don't want people feeling that's been left behind.
Oh no, gosh, no, absolutely. It's really just.
No, just for clarity, I didn't. Just to be understanding, I didn't even mean that the clerical abuse be put back. I just feel that when one issue is introduced, the other ones are kind of, they get attention, but then they're all left sitting, but the victims and survivors are watching, and I think it would be just to do them and justice if we could just try and get a stock take, as well as deal with the other issues that Brian raised, and no doubt we'll deal with as a committee.
Yeah. I'm sorry, just another point on that. So when I had the chair's briefing meeting today with the clerk, I did say just in that period between recess and them taking their actual annual leave, if they can maybe look at what we all agreed and what we put forward at the strategy event, so that we know that we're definitely covering, because everybody had slightly different priorities and stuff, that we can just have a bit of a stock take around what we've actually not ticked off, but you know what I mean, what we've actually covered, and also then to look at the full range of responsibilities within the executive office, so that we are not missing any really important parts. Like, for example, the COVID inquiry recommendations will be coming through soon, for example. So there's that. So are people content then to proceed then? Okay, so correspondence, members, page 57 of your pack, you'll find the summary of committee correspondence. Page 64, there's correspondence from the Northern Ireland Youth Assembly, and you'll see that they've asked to meet with us and come and present, and I'm just wondering, are we content that the clerk adds that as a forward? Okay. So page 279 of your pack, you'll find correspondence from the department regarding historical institutional abuse, and I was just wanting your agreement that I would be able to share that response with the victims and survivors groups. I think we had asked a couple of meetings ago, didn't we?
It was agreed by the committee to forward that.
Yeah, it's just that some of the issues that they'd asked for. There is some correspondence in the pack there around the individual regarding a new civic flag for Northern Ireland, and just wondering, are you in agreement that we would forward that correspondence to the department? Yep. Any other correspondence people wish to discuss?
In terms of the request from Ulster Human Rights Watch, so
yes.
we agree with the request the opportunity to appear before the committee. Were they invited at the same time as the other groups? And what was the response at that time, or had they not responded? Or
Ulster Human Rights Watch hadn't actually responded.
So they responded and just said they were unavailable, and they just wanted to provide the written briefing instead, which they've now supplied.
So what I said at the end of...
They're also requested the opportunity to...
Yeah, now the request has come.
So what I said at the end of the last week, I said that when we come back to this issue around victims and survivors of the Troubles, that we would invite them back. So when we have this next session, so they're still on the agenda, so we will bring them forward. Go ahead.
Yeah. Could we also include Elders for Justice in that, because they weren't available either? So that would be good.
Yeah, pick that up. Okay, any other business? Go ahead.
I raise, Chair. It'll come as no surprise to you. We have today another splash in the newsletter regarding the Executive Committee. And I suppose I just want to go back to the 6th of November and correspondence or dialogue we had between yourself and myself, where you said you never engaged with the Dallo, I never engaged with the First Minister, I never engaged with anybody, I engaged with the clerk who does all the work. Yep. So, Michael, I believe at that meeting you weren't there. On the 6th of November, I had asked for all the information and correspondence relating to this, whether it be text messages, emails to be put in the pack. That has never happened. And you had said you had never engaged with the First Minister.
No, I says I never engaged. So you accused me at that meeting of going through the First Minister or the Dallo to set up the meeting.
I don't think I accused you of anything.
You did. And you've tried to create this false narrative that we are in some ways having this correspondence behind the scenes, which is not the case.
Well, it certainly looks like it when you've seen the text messages to your personal phone.
Sorry. I sent one text message back to acknowledge that
So the First Minister reached out to you.
Well, that's up to the First Minister.
But at no point did you say, listen, I don't want to engage here.
What I said was I acknowledged that I had missed her correspondence overnight, and then I advised her that I was using the official channels, using the clerk to set up the meeting.
Was there any phone calls that taken place?
No, there wasn't any phone calls. Why would there have been a phone call?
Well, it insinuated that the First Minister had tried to get you via phone and you didn't pick up because you thought it was the media.
Yeah, so and what's your question?
What's my question? Well, it's not my question. It's my concern, Chair, that at best you misled the committee, or worse, lied to the committee.
That is a very strong accusation. Now I would ask you to reflect on that. That is, I did not mislead the committee.
Well, we had asked for all the information to be put in the pack. That has never happened.
You asked for all the communication that went from this committee to the private office.
In general.
No, you didn't.
Well,
because I would have picked up on that.
You decided not to declare that the First Minister had reached out to you via back channels.
And well, that's up to the First Minister to answer.
But you're the chair of this committee, and I did say to you, and I suggested to you that you had compromised yourself the day the First Minister had come because you went to the private meeting, and now it turns out there's text messages between the two of you.
I acknowledged that I had missed the call and missed her 2 text messages from the previous evening, and advised her that I had asked the clerk to use the official channels, which is the proper procedure. Now, should I have ignored the First Minister?
I think it would have been honest and transparent and upfront.
The wording of the First Minister's text to me went in an email to members, and I didn't ask for that to happen. The clerk put that in. I asked.
Did it come to you directly, or did it come to you as well as the Dallo?
What?
You had said it come through official channels, and you have just said that the email from the First Minister to yourself.
Then, obviously what happened late at night, whenever the First Minister couldn't get hold of me, so then it was obviously put in an email from the Dallo to you, and that's how he got word of it. I was sleeping.
In the list of correspondence that did go in the pack, the Dallo communicated to me the evening before and then I communicated that to the
Sure.
chair, and then again at 7 o'clock the following morning.
Okay, sorry, let me just bring Carol in here. Go ahead, Carol.
Sorry, Chair.
Sure, this
No, I know, but you've had plenty of time. Go ahead, Carol.
Sure, I just find this line of question very inappropriate.
Oh, it
You've
is,
answered
yeah.
the question. I just wouldn't indulge Timothy in the newsletter anymore. I think this is ridiculous. It's ridiculous.
So, just to draw a line under this,
No.
if you have a
I draw a
problem,
line under, but it was a case of an FOI that had come in from the newsletter,
you did.
which then turned out that there was
So I
text
sa-
messages.
so I
Is
acknowledge
there
that-
anything else to declare?
No, there's not. Well, first of all, I acknowledged the First Minister's missed communication. I advised her I was using official channels, and shock horror, I said, I agree, I want the meeting to be constructive. In what way are you trying to spin this?
I'm not trying to spin it
No, you
anyway.
are.
You must look at
Anyway,
this and take
I'm
a
drawing the
step
line
back
under, if you have a
that
complaint.
this doesn't look good.
I don't look. Whatever the newsletter, I've given up a long time ago worrying about the newsletter, what the newsletter thinks about me or what writes about me. If you have a problem, you go to the Standards Commissioner. Okay.
Is there anything else you want to declare in front of the committee that might come out in further FOIs?
I don't think. I think we'd be really going down the wrong pathway if we said that there should be not any kind of interpretive standard or rule that includes a committee member or a chair from talking to a minister in any shape, form or fashion. I mean, that is not a rule that exists, and why would you want to put that rule? You know, that's an interpretation that you want to
You're trying to
put
create it.
on, you know, this committee, or, you know, some kind of new standard. It is, you know, in no legislation or legislative organisation throughout, committee members can talk to ministers, and ministers can talk to chairs, and what else? You know, nothing untoward has happened in those two. There's nothing to see in those two.
It's it's pathetic actually now at this stage.
Well, if that's what constructive opposition
constructive opposition is right. Let's be constructive about it. You know, I think that there's a slant been put on it, and we have to go down. Like, there's nothing, you know, in terms of the DUP and that, you know, the work is still going on within the executive. The works are still going on between the North-South Ministerial Council. The works and motions are still going on. There's nothing been prevented. The only place that things are prevented from happening is in this committee. By being disruptive. So it's very performative, really. You know, so let's be real about it.
How was I disruptive throughout the committee?
Tim, I've sat through it for weeks now. It is, we're getting nowhere with it. So, like, you know, those two, look at the two text messages. There's really nothing in them. You know, go and look at your, Inspector Clouseau, honestly. It's just, ministers can talk to you as a member of this committee. Ministers can talk to me. Ministers can talk to the chair.
I'm not giving evidence to a committee. If you take this back to the start,
I am not
stems
disputing.
from.
I mean, it was a sorry state of affairs, the whole thing that happened in relation to evidence and the minister, etc., and all of that. It wasn't a good day at the office in any shape, form or fashion. But we're pulling this out, and it's actually having an impact on the work of this committee. Not anywhere else. It's not disturbing. It's the performatory nature of it now that I think we really have to draw a line under, because it's going nowhere. You know, David Thompson will do another wee bit tomorrow in the newsletter or whatever. It's just leave it. Leave it. And yes, constructive opposition. I'd like you to be constructive as well.
Okay, go ahead, Brian.
Yep, I don't think we do need to rehash and members be familiar with my disappointment with how the First Minister behaved on the day after agreeing to come to committee. But we know that's all understood. So the only valid point in the article, as a point of fact, is it quotes you, Chair, as having said, "I never engaged with the First Minister."
I don't engage with her,
But in fairness to the article, you'd had a text message exchange with her, you know, so
It was in the
discuss
context of this false narrative that he has been trying to create.
That is nonsense.
No,
It's not me that's
I'm just
creating
saying
that false
Well,
narrative.
I was answering in that context because I'm fed up with these
Very
accusations.
selective context.
So, well, I'm
Well, it's
trying
been
to
going
speak.
on. Well, anyway, go ahead.
So, no, but I mean, I accept all MLAs should speak to each other at times, you know, when they've opportunity. But in terms of your role as chair, it is relevant if text messages were passed on through an FOI request. If that's how this came about, then clearly to say you never engage with the First Minister. Obviously, you do.
Engage with her.
Well. The exchange of text messages would be called engaging.
The assumption that he has been trying, that Timothy has been trying to create, is that we in some way colluded.
Well, you did protect her the whole way through the
No, I didn't.
session.
No, the fact that the questions that you were asking were not within the responsibility of this committee as a scrutiny in terms of the work of the Executive Office, that's on news. If you couldn't with
But it's the First Minister.
No, and she was here representing the Executive
Who
Office
has to
Department.
comply with the ministerial code.
Well,
And you can
you need to go to the Standards Commissioner then, because that's not our role. That's not our role.
So does the ministerial code not apply to the First Minister? Yes, it does.
Well, this is not. We are a scrutiny committee for the Executive Office Department. Its roles, functions, and services. If you feel that the ministerial code has been in any way breached, you go to the Standards Commissioner. That's not our role. Okay. Thank you, everyone. I'll see you all next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Committee Room 29. Sound. 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 Committee Room 29. Sound.